Many chess players have a hard time meeting d4 because of the strategic flexibility that it offers. White can of course play with the queen's gambit with c4, but there are also other options like bringing the knight out to f3, playing the London system, and many other systems that we will see in this video. Now, originally I had planned to actually offer this as a paid course, but then I decided why not be generous and just give you a really deep dive into how to meet d4. And the system I'm going to be covering is actually a continuation of something I covered in a previous How to Meet D4 video 4 years ago on this channel. If you want to ensure that you don't miss out on future videos like these sort of deep dives, do make sure to hit the subscribe button. And for those of you who are already subscribers, you can use a small trick where you can tap that notification bell and set notifications to all, and that will ensure that you get all of the videos I release in your feed. But in that video, I recommended the move of e6, the semi-Slav defense. And that is technically the main line and, of course, a very, very reliable system. But for this one, I want to go a little bit of a different path instead. And before I show you that, I want to also touch on a few alternatives because there are different ways, of course, you can play against d4, but I also do want to touch on a few common mistakes that happen at lower levels, as well as what are some of the disadvantages of other defenses to d4, so that then you can also better understand what white is trying to do. A very common mistake you'll see at lower levels is going to be to play a move like knight f6, the Marshall defense, because then after c takes d5, white is just able to take over the center with e4 or knight f3 first. And a position like this one is just going to be very, very passive for black, where white just has the space, our pieces are very stuck, and white is just going to have a really big advantage here. And that sort of explains a little bit why I like the Slav, because it means that if they do take our pawn, then we can then take and we keep a pawn in the center. And also gives a very nice square on c6 for the knight. Because you might be thinking, well, the one disadvantage of c6 is that now this knight is not able to go to this square, which is true. But at the same time, you do get some extra flexibility when you play this move, where, for example, it gives you the option to play d takes c4 and then try to hang on to that extra pawn with the move of b5. And I hope that for those of you who have been watching for a while, that you do appreciate these, color commentary as a way to really maintain and remember the ideas a lot more powerfully to apply them in your own games. If you're enjoying that, do make sure to hit the like button so I know to do this more often moving forward. In any case, there are other ways white can play, like they're not forced to go and just bring the knights out. They can also play moves like pawn up. We're also going to cover what happens if they do play moves like developing their bishop, which it's not a very good move. When I checked the Lichess database, I did see that this bishop g5 was played quite a bit, so it's good to know how to be ready for it. And do make sure to watch the video all the way until the end so that we can also cover how to deal with some of those sidelines, because something you will notice is that it's not always going to be a great idea to play just a normal Slav sub with c6 against these systems. There will be a little bit of a different approach I'll recommend that still keeps the game in the Slav spirit, where the opponent is not going to punish you for just blindly following it like it's an opening scheme where you just put your blindfold on and you open your eyes when it's move 20. So with that, I will mention that for other openings, that if you do play the King's Indian, one thing about it is that it's an opening that's, even though some people think of it as a system opening, it's not really a system opening, because you kind of have to know really what you're doing in a lot of the rising positions, that, these sort of close positions after d5 or a later d5 are not really going to be to everybody's taste. And I think in my experience, you really have to put a lot of work into really kind of understand how to play these positions as black. And it's not including that, at a high level, moves like bishop e2 and h3 are also practically somewhat annoying for black, but Indians are a little bullish on white's chances in positions like this. And also, if you do play the Nimzo move order, which was, by the way, a move order actually recommended in the How to Meet D4 Part 1 video, where my repertoire there was basically to play the semi-Slav with this delayed move order. And the point of this is basically to then play the Nimzo in turn. Anyway, I've covered the Nimzo also, and it is, you could say, probably almost my favorite opening against d4 over the last nearly 20 or so years. At the same time, this is also the absolute main line at master play, and you're going to have to put in a fair bit of work to kind of, play this at a high level. because this is just like the most common moves for both sides. And what you'll see modern grandmasters do is that modern grandmasters these days tend to prefer to try to find some shortcut that the opponent is not going to know so well, where you don't have to spend thousands of hours memorizing the theory, but where instead you can just play like more like healthy ideas, play on a more human level, and that'll just allow you to just have more time for things you're outside of just learning opening theory, because the opening is just one part of the game at the end of the day. And also within D5, like there are obviously other systems like, the Queen's Gambit declined or, the Queen's Gambit accepted. But I think with the Slav, it just has that extra flexibility where you have the option to either develop your bishop actively or play E6. You can take the pawn on C4 or you can just hold that center together. There's some different ideas like Moran approaches and stuff within the mix as well. Whereas when you play E6, you do have the question of how to get your C8 bishop into the game. And while there are ways to resolve it, for example, with a later fianchetto or if they take, you get this open diagonal. It is true these positions I think are a little bit easier for white to play. And with DC4, you also kind of have to know what you're doing. Like if they play E4. When I was looking in the database, a lot of players really didn't know what to do as black. Like they would just let white take the pawn and just give white that dominant central position like we saw in the Marshall defense before. So yeah, there's still moves you can play to make it work as black, but the Queen's Gambit except is not as simple as taking a pawn, because you do try to hang on to it. You may run into some problems with with this pawn structure coming under a lot of fire. Whereas by playing c6 and taking later, you kind of avoid a lot of those problems where you can often end up in hot water if you do try too hard to hang on to the extra pawn in the Queen's Gambit accepted, then you just don't in the same way in the Slav. And with that, I think we're ready to go a little bit deeper into, you know, how to actually make the Slav work as black. And I've already kind of overviewed some of the different options that white can play. But the approach I will take, because this is going to be a bit of a long video, I will be presenting as if it was basically a full course. I'm going to start with the most common in the Lichess database, because I really relied on the Lichess database when I created this, because this is based on, a course I was preparing earlier this year. And at that time, the chess.com explorer of, 30 billion games didn't exist. But the Lichess database does still have 8 million games and still the option to sort it by rating. So you're still going to get a lot of the same insights, even though the sample size is a little bit smaller. But the move of knight c3, then knight f3 is going to be the most common. And I do want to take a moment to not just show you my recommended move of d takes c4, but to also mention a few alternatives as well. Because one of the reasons why I decided to present this as a free video rather than a paid course is that if I was going to do it as a paid course, it would have been basically having to do it kind of their way in a sense. And I just realized that didn't really fit with the kind of the style of my coaching and delivery that I want to do. Because I do think the way you really master an opening is not just to have like one way to play absolutely everything and no alternatives, but actually say, okay, these are a few different ways to play these positions and to, kind of have a more broader understanding of how a position to play out rather than trying to like it's cramming for a test. Because chess, it is a game of solving problems, but it's also a game of setting problems to the opponent, right? So I've already kind of mentioned DC4 is my recommended move, E6 is the semi-Slav, and also the move A6 to Chebanenko is interesting as well, and it is something I may end up covering in a future video if there is enough interest for it. It is a bit more of a master level opening, but it does have a certain commonality of with DC4 that it is quite a flexible move for black. However, there are a few mistakes that black also sometimes plays in practice they do want to make sure I touched on real quickly. So, for example, the moves that are most common when I checked the chess.com database recently, and this was true across the different levels, was the moves of bishop g4 and bishop f5, which actually fit with my own experience playing on chess.com. Bullet, that my opponents were playing this more often than like semi-Slav or d takes c4. However, both moves are going to be mistakes. And maybe you can let me know in the comments below what you think would be the best move for white or best continuation after bishop to f5. Let's see how many of you know this already. So it is something I have actually covered in a previous video of mine on the channel. I think it was a game between Ding against Maxime Vacher-Lagrave from memory that I covered on here way back. But the reason that bishop f5 isn't so good here is basically because now the pawn on b7 is undefended. And so it means that after it takes, Technically, you could also start with queen b3, but I think it's a bit more precise to take the pawn first. But in a position like this, we see it's going to be very hard for black to defend that pawn on b7. I'm not going to go into the full details because that's more a topic for a video I already covered on the channel. But you can sort of see that a move like queen b6 is going to lose a pawn tactically because if knight takes d5 and either take or queen takes b3 and this sort of thing is just an extra pawn for white. And if you play a move such as b6 that ends up losing by force for reasons that are a little beyond the scope of this video. And so the best move for black apparently is to play bishop c8, but then compared to the lines of the exchange Slav that we'll see that white is just ahead 2 full tempi compared to those positions, so it's really not a good outcome for black. And similarly, bishop g4 is going to run into... Actually, we can even do better than queen b3. We can actually go knight e5 first, just avoiding double pawns. And then if they move the bishop back, let's say to h5, for example, again, we're just going to take, and we can go queen b3, and it's even harder here for black to defend this pawn without running into knight takes d5, winning a pawn. And so at the end of the day, this is just not really going to be very playable for black, and that actually explains a lot why we played a move of dc4. It's not just about playing the move b5 and keeping the extra pawn, but it's also preparing for us to be able to develop the bishop actively to f5 without running into that queen b3 move. So do make sure to put that one in your memory bank. So we play d takes c4, we take the pawn to develop the bishop. And if you play the Caro-Kann against e4, I think you'll really like the similarity of ideas, because the main idea of the Caro-Kann, if we do put that on the board real quick, is basically to get your light squared bishop outside the pawn chain. Like that's a big difference compared to the French, where the bishop can often end up being stuck after the move of e5 now or later on. But when you play the Caro-Kann, like you're able to get your bishop developed actively, something like this, or this, or if they play e takes d5, you can try to get the bishop on g4 in different ways. Like this is the main line, for example. So you can sort of see the point across is like the common thread bring all of the Caro-Kann lines together is being able to develop the bishop first and then push our pawn so that we have no bad pawns and no bad pieces, which regular viewers of the channel, you'll know there's no bad pawns, no bad pieces as an Illingworthism by now. But that's kind of what we're going for with this repertoire here. We're just going to develop our pieces naturally and get a position with no bad pawns and no bad pieces. Now, in your own games, I actually think that at lower levels, you're not going to face a4. Well, it'll be faced at a similar frequency or not as much as moves like e3 or e4. But I'm going to start with a4 because it is the most critical move. Like, it's very easy just to play b5 against everything else and just keep the extra pawn. So let's start with a4 and go from there. So the move bishop f5 is the one traditionally considered the most reliable, just not letting white take the center with e4 like it might happen after, say, e6, for example, which is still a fine line for black, but it does require a lot more memorization, whereas with bishop f5, you'd have a bit more natural piece play. Here, white kind of has two main choices, either to go e3 or to play knight to e5, and both moves have the same idea of getting back the pawn on c4. So I think something that's important to understand is that with this, you are not really playing to try to keep the extra pawn, but you're playing just to give it back so that your remaining pieces can develop active squares. You can see here how the b4 square is a bit of a sore point for white. And I do think castling here is a little bit more flexible than knight d7 for reasons that will become especially evident when we see how we meet some of these queen moves. Where having a knight on b8 instead is going to give us some extra options. And also after queen e2, a really good question to ask in chess is to ask the question, well, what is the opponent's idea? Or if you're a less advanced player, I wouldn't even say idea, I just ask, what is the opponent's threat? And it turns out that, well, if they can play e4 to have the pawns side by side in the center, so we can now go for a little bit of a prophylaxis, where we can play the move of bishop to g6, so that if they do play e4 now, we can simply take and win a pawn in this position. The reason it wouldn't work after knight bd7, in case you're wondering about that, is that now, if bishop takes c3, they would have the move of ef5 to hit our pawn and the bishop at the same time. And while you can still play bishop g6 anyway and still play those positions, I just think it's a lot easier to just avoid e4 and kind of force white to come up with a different plan. And I'm going to go a little bit deep into these positions. Like, it's not going to be a quite an exhaustive coverage of, say, my Safari time armor video for comparison, which I've uploaded recently or will be pretty soon. I kind of record like a lot of videos, I sometimes lose track of what I actually recorded, but 95, it's the most principled move where white is going to try to grab our bishop pair. But something I think you're going to really like about the Slav is the fact that even when they do trade off your bishop for a knight and they get the bishop pair advantage, the thing is, look at our pawn structure. And I want you to remember Capablanca's principle, like, even if you have to, like, grab a pen and paper and, like, write it down, on a post-it note or whatever, it'll really help to consolidate this idea that we want to place our pawns. There's two parts to it. The first part is that we want to place our pawns on the same color complex as the opponent's unopposed bishop, which obviously is the bishop on c4. But you can see that whichever diagonal they kind of go to, we just have this brick wall where we're just making it really hard for white to really leverage their light square advantage. And meanwhile, the other part of Capablanca's principle is to place the pawns on opposite color complex to our remaining bishop. So that means we got a dark squared bishop here, we put the pawns on a light squares. If we had a light squared bishop, then we put the pawns on the dark squares. Makes sense. And at this point, white probably should play the move of rook d1, putting the rook opposite the queen. Because in this position, a lot of black's plans are going to be centered around, if I just remove these arrows just so it's not, like a paint just sploshed everywhere like a little kid. So black's break is going to be to play e5 in this position. That way we're able to fight back in the center and, have some quite decent counter players, as we're about to see. So white should play the move rook d1, because now e5 is just going to run into this pin. And so you can put the queen on a lot of different squares. Like, you could also put it on c7. You could also put it on e7 to prepare e5. But I like queen a5 because when I was picking out these moves, basically I was looking at from not just the perspective of what is the top engine line, but also from the perspective of what is scoring the best in practice. Not in terms of master practice, but in terms of, games, in these billion game databases, like multi-billion game databases. Like, the MC opponents are usually going to play what's going to give you the best score, and that's really was the impetus for my recommendations. And bishop b2, yeah, is the move they usually play, just connecting the rooks. And now I just like keeping our options open. We keep him guessing as to whether we're going to go c5 or e5. Those are really the two key middle game breaks to play in the Slav. You want to either go e5 or go c5. Which one you'll play will kind of depend on the position, but it's going to be one of those two moves you're going to play to challenge the extra space in the pawn on d4. The move bishop e1 might look a little bit weird, but I'll kind of show you after this variation what some of the problems can be for white if they do play e4. So some of these moves are going to make a lot more sense in a few minutes. But basically, I like the move of e5. Now, if you want to equalize, the move c5 is a very reliable equalizer, in my opinion. Like, in a position like this, black is definitely, not in any way worse in a position like this one. Computer saying can even sack the pawn, but okay, giving me their bishop pair is also going to be totally fine here, of course. Like, obviously, black is not in any sort of real danger. Like, again, no bad pawns, no bad pieces. You're going to hear me say that a lot. But I think with the move e5, it kind of gives, in my opinion, more chance to play for a win than if you have a more symmetrical kind of structure. I mean, the engine says a symmetrical structure is still pretty good for black, but e5, yeah, this is the one that kind of scores better and just feels like, to my mind, the one which will give you the better results. And the idea of e5 is kind of twofold. Well, there's kind of three different ways a structure can play out. The first one is that they take our pawn, and then we just take back. And notice how our knight got a lot more active with the recapture. And again, if we ask the question in terms of, well, what is white's idea? Well, eventually they want to try and kick away our knight and get these pawns rolling on this majority. And so a move like g5 is the very solid one. And so the sort of theme you're going to notice in a lot of these Slav middle games, which I think is going to be very exciting for a lot of you, is that we can basically, we don't necessarily have to do anything too crazy in order to win in the Slav. Because a lot of the times what we're doing is we're just doing in a martial arts style. We take the opponent's force, like moves like a4, moves like e4 when they really try to come at us, and we just take that force and we use it against them, where we flow with that force, and then by move 20 or move 30, then it's left with all these weaknesses, like the weak the outpost on b4, the backward pawn on b2, and then we just use those weaknesses to leave them overextended, take advantage, and then win that way. And I think this is a reason also why a lot of the quite strong Soviet GMs like to play the Slav as black as one of their main defenses, because it really does fit with that very Russian style of chess of like just keeping things very simple and very solid and practical. Now, if white were to play a different move, so say if they do keep the tension, like instead of d5, they do just play a move like bishop b3. If they do go into an IQP position like this, I think this is just very comfortable for black, where you can play rook e8, you can play knight b6, like both moves are, the order can be changed. But the point is still the same, that they still have those weaknesses. And even though they do have an open position with the bishop here, the fact that we can just lock it down with the knight blockade is just much more important here. And so I'd say the move d5 really is the main alternative and probably the better move for white to play, trying to open to get things up for the bishops. But again, a really great question to ask when the opponent has an idea or a threat is just to ask, can we just ignore that threat? And I really believe the move e4 is such a lovely move, where you get that space advantage in the center, and you're ready to bring the knight to e5 and really sort of take advantage of that small weakness of the d3 square. After bishop to b3, it's kind of a bit of a prophylaxis against knight e5 when I'm trying to go after the bishop. And what I analyzed here, like there's a lot of good moves, like rook e8 is also quite good as a way to defend the pawn in advance and get the final piece in the game. But the move that I analyzed was like rook b8, and I kind of realized that here, if white doesn't find this trick of knight takes e4, they're actually going to kind of be worse once we get the like the bishop and the knight kind of in action like this. And if they do find this trick, yeah, it is just going to be an equal position at the end of the day. And we get the pawn back. We've got enough active counterplay with the rook and the passed pawn to make up for the bishop versus knight advantage of white. It's not much of an advantage for white, but it is worth mentioning. And so with that, you can sort of see again, like this is very like Illingworth coded, right? To go really deep into not just the opening, but really showing you how the typical middle games play out. And if white does play e4 here, so I like to say loose pieces drop off. The short way of saying it's LPDO. Do write LPDO in the comments just so I know you've got it. But basically, the story is that I think it was in this book, Practical Chess, like Secrets of Practical Chess by GM John Nunn. Actually, a classic book I probably should, go and read again at some point. But there's a really cool idea of loose pieces drop off that you mentioned, which is really looking for the undefended pieces in your camp and the opponent's camp, because that's where a lot of chess tactics are going to come from. And based on that, you've probably already seen this move of knight to b6, where we're hitting that pawn, but we're also going after the bishop pair, which is really white's pride and joy in a position like this. Yeah, they do have extra space, but the problem for them is that in the Slav, that extra space can become a bit of a disadvantage, especially when you have a lot of the minor pieces traded, because you can see that we're not really suffering from a cramp. All of our pieces are just going to have really good squares after rook fd8. We've got some ideas to go g5, g4, and try to create a second weakness. And overall, it just means that black is just doing very well. Like, one trick you can go for is if they play rook here. This is a good moment to pause the video, by the way, if you do want to really train your tactical vision. That's the hint I'm going to give. So again, it's all about using the opponent's weaknesses against them. With f3 to have open up this diagonal, and so it means that we can now take the pawn. And they're not going to be able to take back twice, because then after bishop c5, we do just win the queen. And so with that, that means we can go back a little bit earlier. And also just for the sake of objectivity, I will mention that knight a2 is probably the best move for white. At first, the engine will tell you that white can even fight for an advantage with this, just saying they've got the bishop pair, the space, and this sort of thing. But after e5, I analysed it more deeply, and I found that black's actually just totally fine here, where we're just preparing to bring our pieces back to safety to consolidate that extra pawn. And yeah, I mean, in this case, the position is about equal. Like at first, stockfish will say white's a little better, but if you go deeper into some lines, it does just come to equality at the end. So anyhow, that really gives a good picture, I think, how these kind of middle games typically play out with the knight g6, hg6 kind of structure. Also, a very common mistake you will see is a move like e4, and you might already know the idea for black, as we just saw it a moment ago, that we can just go knight to b6. And there's a few ways that can play out, but in all of them, you're just doing very, very well. So, for example, defending the pawn doesn't really work for white because then you can just take and okay, you can also play knight c4 first, but either way, you are basically just winning a pawn and or a pawn up for nothing. Similar thing with bishop e3 as you can see here. So white's best try is to play e5 and try to make it a bit more messy. But after queen d4, we do still have a good position. This line is a little bit long-winded. I probably am going to leave it actually, like it's one I had originally prepared for the course, but I think it's not really that critical. Like just knowing knight b6 and winning the pawn is kind of good enough for our purposes. It is true that this is a topic like if there is enough demand for it, I might actually create my own sort of Slav course, but with more like powerful recommendations even than what I'm showing here. Because these ones are definitely aimed more at kind of just beating the general population of opponents. Like, okay, these are 8 billion games, this is what most of your opponents struggle with. But for those who are sort of looking for something that is more like a bit more advanced and aimed at like being able to outplay like even more advanced players like 1600, 1800 plus. Yeah, this will sort of do it to a certain extent, but if you do want something even more than that, just let me know in the comments down below. And it's something that I'm not going to promise, but it's something I will consider if there's the demand for it. And if I place rook d1 instead, a lot of the time it's just going to actually, you might think it'll just lead to the same kind of territory like knight e5 and they're going to take. But the reason it's a less precise move order here is that you can basically just take and then play knight to d7. Please don't run into knight d5, e4 because you will be losing a piece either like this or like this with the double attack on the bishop and on the queen that results with the recapture. So make sure to put the knight on d7 and keep it safe. But you'll notice that in this structure, black is just very, very comfortable. They've got the double pawns and we can play pretty easily around the space. And something you might also notice here in this position is, again, we can just ignore their move of bishop h4 because we're just faster. But like, just look at how of all of the weaknesses that white has in this kind of position. Like bishop h4, we can just take and queen a5, and like this pawn is weak. We've got the e4 outpost for the knight. Just that this linear weaknesses means that white is in a very, very bad shape here. And there are other moves they can play, like some quieter moves, but if they play h3, even just something like this is very similar to what we were just looking at. And also if bishop d3, you can just, again, just let them take. And it's even a better version, in my opinion, when you trade off the light squared bishops rather than giving up the bishop for a knight. And I think you already know, like, when they play e4, it's just a very thematic move to, as black, to just play e5 and just hit back in the center, not letting him just, completely run us over, like would happen in the Grunfeld, for example. So white usually goes d5 just to avoid, like, ed4 and that good queenside majority structure we were looking at a bit earlier. But black is just very comfortable. Like, we have even moves like bishop c3 in the future to potentially create some more weaknesses. So it's a position where black is the one who is slightly more comfortable, has a slightly more comfortable side of equality. And with that, I think we can really move to some of the alternatives. So with that, I'm going to mainly focus on the move queen b3 and knight to h4, but I do realize it's kind of going to be more useful for like two different groups of people where I think for the less advanced students, like below 1800, 2000, the queen b3 is going to be the more important line. But if you are someone who's like trying to become a title player or already is a title player, then that's the move that's going to be the more critical one for us. But after queen b3, let me ask you this. What do you think is the move that black should play in this position here? And this one, actually, the first time I saw it, it kind of made an impression on me, so there is no shame at all if you don't see it without me telling you. But basically, in a position like this, you want to play the move c5 because a5 is going to run into knight a2, and even though you do still have compensation even there, it's not really an ideal kind of setting. And if you play queen to e7, then white has some moves like knight h4 that are going to give white a sort of better version of some of the knight h4 lines, because we'll see the queen doesn't really go to e7 so quickly in those positions. And so for that reason, the idea of c5 is that they take our pawn, and then we have this very cool move of a5. Obviously, taking the pawn will just run into, queen takes b7. But by playing a5, it stabilizes the bishop so that we can end up taking back that pawn later when the coast is clear. Usually white plays the move of rook to d1 because, like, if they go knight d4, you can even just bring the bishop back and play in a very similar way to what we'll see in the main line. But after rook d1, queen e7. I like this e7 square because it just keeps off the c file because the c file will be very likely open in the near future. And it's still interesting to note that in most of the games, white wasn't just playing bishop d2 and accepting solid equality, which you can get in pretty much a million ways from here as black. But they were playing this move as c6, and I think probably the attraction for white was maybe that in a position like this, you've got the isolated pawns as black. But it actually ends up being a really big advantage because it gives us the b file for the rook, and it also means that they have actually the pawn on b2 is going to be a much bigger weakness than the c6 pawn will be. And I mean, in a position like this, say if we go even bishop d6, you can kind of feel like how the white king is going to be kind of feeling the draft once we get this sort of attack going. So it's going to very easily turn very badly against white from here. In any case, I do also want to cover the move knight h4, which, like I said, if you're rated below like 1800, 2000, you can probably get away with not knowing how to deal with it. But I do think knight bd7 is just the move that kind of feels right to me because let's say if you try to avoid the exchange of this bishop, which I have done in some games myself in the past, but I just think that this position after g4 and knight g2 is just going to be very, very nice for white. Because one of the main things you want to try to avoid in these classical Slav positions, this e3, by the way, is known as the Dutch variation, in case you're wondering. But you really want to avoid a position like this one as black, where you're just stuck with this bishop just stuck behind the pawns. It's kind of hard to get really sort of active play you want, and it just white has this very nice control. So it's kind of important that we want to play a little bit more actively than that. And it turns out that actually this structure after knight f5 is not even so bad for black, because again you can see how our pawns really complement our remaining bishop quite nicely and fight against their bishop. And we also have a little bit of a blockade on the light squares, where it's not going to be so easy for white to open up the position and just really use their bishop pair as such. White usually does play queen c2, because queen b3, a5 now, and the knight a2 move is just not really going to be as effective anymore. Like if they do take the pawn, they actually run into some problems here, like rook b8 and if queen c6, like this is a bit computerish, but it's kind of a cool little trap that actually wasn't in my original course content I'd prepared, but basically just going to go for rook b6, and it's just going to turn out that their king just gets completely owned at this point. So that's a bit of an advanced but a very cool trap. And queen f3, like we want to play g6 anyway, and build this pawn chain. So we're really not too concerned about it. If you know of the line of the Korchnoi Karakan, like we go knight f6, e8 takes f6, it's kind of like we just have a much better version of that here, where our piece is going to very natural squares. So queen c2, yeah, is going to be more the move for white. And I did notice when I was looking in the Lichess database that the move f3 is actually one that scores quite well for white, and it's the reason why I've decided to cover it, because I do think it is an important move where we should be quite precise. So in this position, I really like the move of rook to c8. Putting the rook opposite the queen, preparing some c5 breaks for counterplay. And the reason we're keeping the queen on d8 is that if white goes e4 here, we can then play the move of knight b6 and go for this attack. And there is a bit more to know as well, like for master players, like I did go a bit deeper in my own notes. But I think that, again, just to kind of keep it a bit simpler for the majority, I will. Yeah, there was some case where I want to just show all my analysis, I'll just kind of refer to it rather than going too deep into the weeds. But if they don't play e4, we're just going to play c5. That's going to be the key move where it might seem a bit counterintuitive to open up the position when the opponent has the bishop pair advantage. The thing is, though, what's more important with the opening a position is for the side that has the better development, and we can kind of see that is going to be black here. Also, there is a bit of a computerish trick that after bishop a5, you can actually let them fork you because you do get the piece back, and you end up having really good compensation with with that lead in development as black here. But okay, this is really going a little bit into the weeds of things. But after bishop a2 instead, yeah, once again, I think it's just good just to get the pieces out. Like if they go knight b5, you just can play the move of queen b6 and just cover the knight to d6 move that way. Queen c4, rook f8, or queen b3, rook e7 are both just going to be fine for black. Like you've got enough active piece play and pressure on e3 to make up for the white bishop pair here. So with that, the move of queen f2 is the one I really had as my main move, just getting out of the pin. And I think it's an important point that we don't want to just rush and just take the pawn that's being offered. Because in that instance, white does get a lot of active play with the bishop pair, and white does actually have a bit of an advantage in this position. So just keep in mind that we don't want to necessarily just grab the first pawn they offer, right? But it just will be more effective to just keep the tension and keep the pressure. And there's actually a really cool trick that black has here, which it's not the only way to play. Like Erring is going to be fine for black at this stage. But if you know the move of f4 to kind of split up their structure, it does make your life a lot easier. In a position like this one, for example. I mean, black is just very, very comfortable. These pawns are a bit weak and also in a more closed position. It's going to be harder for the bishops to fight well against the knights, so that really does work in our favour. And with that, that pretty much concludes the picture of the Dutch variation with e3. And I do realise, we went quite deep into it, but it's also what you're most likely to face in your own games if we take the most common move on every move. And that's why I think it was important to cover it first and really do it justice, right? Now, the next move I'm going to cover is knight e5, the Alakin variation. And the reason it's called the Alakin variation is because of this match between Uwe against Alakin, where they were often debating this variation like Queen c7, and they're often getting a position like this with Bishop f4. And okay, these days Morozevic's g5 is kind of considered like the main line. Although modern Indians do think playing f6 first is maybe a bit more precise, but this is actually not the approach I'm going to be recommending because there is a lot of theory attached to these lines where you do have to have a good memory. And I do think white does have like some decent chance of a small edge in these positions. There is also knight b6, like this is another approach that you will sometimes see as well. And kind of the reason of playing knight d7 there is just to avoid something like e6, f3, and white just being able to take the center with e4 and have that. Again, like I said, that position where you have the pawn on e4 and the bishop just very passive on g6. I'm actually going to suggest a creative approach that, to be fair, actually I did learn of another very interesting idea it was played in a match, in a game like Prague against Caruana in the FIDE Candidates. I've already covered that one on my YouTube channel though, so I'm going to go a little bit of a different approach here. And because in that game, like Queen c7 was a move they played, where it kind of went for this sort of thing. But since I've already covered it on YouTube, I'm going to show another approach that I will admit, if you're playing against like master opponents like in classical, this approach probably isn't going to work as well as the main lines. But I think for everybody else, it's just going to be a really practical and very annoying system to deal with. And that's the move of knight to a6. Now, to be fair, it's not like I'm the first person to say it. It's also a move that has been covered in Cyrus Lakdawala's old book on the Slav. It was published like 14 years ago now or something. But the idea is very clear cut here, that we just want to play the move of knight b4 and go for this four. And if they now play the move of f3, which is the move that white's most often plays here by some margin, based on the online databases like on Lichess, chess.com, even the master data is actually it's the more common move as well, from memory. But the problem though is that we now have the move of knight d7, and the idea is that we're now going to play this move of e5, where we're just able to hit back in the center, and white actually is already struggling for equality. In fact, if they do play the move of e4, like I'm just going to show you the most common moves for both sides, just so you can kind of see the trap. But then after e takes d4, we're just going for this counterattack. Great players find ways to ignore the opponent's threats powerfully, and after queen takes d4, we have another intermezzo of knight b4, and with this royal fork, it's actually very hard for white already to survive. Like after queen d1 and bishop e6. Believe it or not, this position is actually already technically winning for black, with white playing their most common moves. And I hope that a variation like this really kind of embodies the spirit of this repertoire, where I'm not necessarily going to be covering like the top engine line or what the top masters are playing, but really show what I believe is going to give you the best score against the overall chess population in your own games. So that whether you're playing someone like 1,000 or playing someone 2,000, you're going to be really playing to punish the mistakes that they actually make in real time. And it also means, it's nice thing when you look at master games, it often happens that you're looking at continuations that you're just not really going to face much yourself. So it's nice to actually, prepare what you're actually going to get over the board or online. Because white normally plays the move of bishop e3. Although it's true, even bishop e2 doesn't really solve the problems either. But after bishop e3, knight c5, we're just ready to play knight d3. Cut off the communication to the knight on c4, and actually that's what will happen most often. Like usually white played bishop e2, and you can just see after knight d3, and then the move of bishop c4 that black just wins a piece and the game is just over. And there's not much I can really do about it. Like even if they take on c5, the position is just still so miserable where they can't even castle short because our bishop is covering this square. And a position like this is basically technically winning for black. You can even just bring the rooks in, and it's just going to be very hard to resist the pressure. So this really demonstrates what the kind of dream is for black when you play something like this. If they play e takes f5, you can even just take and queen f6, and that fork is annoying, and you just get a really strong initiative that even persists into the endgame. Actually, when we look at how in two moves all of our pieces are going to be in the attack, while white has only one piece past the back rank right now. So we're clearly entering the middle game a lot faster than white ever will. For that reason, it means that actually e4 is a bit of a mistake, and the move that white really should play instead, which at first glance it looks like a blunder, but basically they should play the move of d takes e5 in this position. Also, by the way, if they do play knight takes e5, then again, like this idea of just taking and playing knight b4, or playing king d1 long castle, like either way, you're just going to have a very strong initiative for the pawn here. Their light squares are just way too weak in this position. And so after d5, it looks like a blunder because loose pieces drop off. You do have the move of queen to h4. But then after g3 takes, white does have the move e4, and this is kind of their idea to try to get the piece back. But even here, I still think black is just has a much more comfortable position. Actually, looking at this, there is also a very interesting alternative of knight b4, which I didn't cover in my original notes, but actually think is a very interesting alternative too, if you want to explore that. However, the move queen e5 is a direction I focused on more when I was preparing this course, and in fact, the best move for white is very counterintuitive. Like, the move queen e2 is what's almost always played, but then we can play knight b4. Now, we're not forced to trade and just help them develop. Instead, we can use that pin to threaten the knight c2 fork. And if they're playing the move king f2 anyway, like, that's already a bit of a concession. And in just 15 moves, all of our pieces are about to enter the game. We're one move away from full development. Whereas white is just, again, only having the knight past the back rank. The lack of development really does hurt white quite a lot, and white doesn't even have any material to show for it. If white plays bishop f4, which again I'm just showing you the most common move by white in the database, knight e d3 is just an absolutely crushing move. Because after takes, bishop c1. I'm not going to make this one a puzzle, because there's actually a lot of good moves for black here that keep a very big advantage. But the one that is sort of the coup de grace is going to be knight takes b2, where we clear the way for rook d2. And I mean, as long as your technique is somewhat competent, you are going to win this very, very easily with extra pawn, better bishop, and the outside majority on the queen side, 3-1, which obviously the king is a million miles away from. So with that, the way that white should play instead in this position is king f2, and yeah, that's the one way in which white's not just going to be worse out of the opening. But here as well, I think black is pretty happy. Like, you've got an extra pawn, and yeah, white's got compensation because of our king being stuck here, but we do have, ways to kind of solve some of those problems. So overall, I'm not too concerned here as black. But that's kind of really the worst case scenario after f3. Now, if white does play a bit differently, like if they go knight d7, obviously we take with the bishop because we don't want e4 to come with tempo. And let me ask you this. What do you think is going to be the move for black to play now? Because finding this move is going to make the difference between having the more comfortable position and white just being better. So what we want to do here is we want to play the move of e5 and hit back in the center, like takes bishop e6. Now our bishop can get out compared to the immediate bishop to e6. And also we see a lot in the Slav, like this pawn can be very annoying in just securing a lot of weak squares in the opponent's position and also make it kind of hard for their bishop to get out actively. But if they do take the pawn, which is probably what they should do, well then we can go knight b4 and the threat of the fork is going to be quite annoying. And even if they do find this slightly computerish move of king e2 with a king in the center, realizing that this does come with a check, so you're not winning material immediately. But that does explain the move of queen e7 first as an interesting way to kind of keep that on the board. And yeah, the position objectively is equal according to the computer, but I think that our play is just a bit more active, and it's going to be a little harder for white to coordinate with with their king in the center. In the worst case, you can also just even repeat moves and like just make a draw, but there are ways to play on as well if you want to. But it's always nice having kind of a draw in the pocket when you play something, because that can also be very useful when playing a high rated player. So we can kind of see that, yeah, if white plays the usual idea of 95 of f3 and e4, it just really works in our favor here. The move knight c4 is the second most common, but it's one that really does just serve us very well. Like, if they go knight a3, we're just going to push in the center and, again, just have a very nice active position with the rook coming to the d file and the pressure on the pawn. The move 93 is more common, but it's actually probably almost a worse move, funnily enough, because a really nice trick that we have, and actually one I have covered in a course of mine in the past, is this really bodacious move of knight to g4. We're basically luring the knight away so that we can then play knight c2, but it actually gets worse than that than just the fork, because after king d2 we actually have checkmate in just 11 moves. And so, again, we can see really this is the power of the practical Slav, is that we're able to play in a way where if the opponent makes the most natural moves, we can just punish them in a very direct fashion. That being said, this is kind of obviously like the good news, that most of the time your opponent's going to make these mistakes like f3 or knight c4, and you can even just get an advantage out of the opening against all but like the absolute best moves for white after that. But there is a little bit of a catch that I should mention, and that is that the move of e3 is a much better move for whites. And it does set up a little bit of a counter trick, realizing that after knight b4 that they can just ignore this and play bishop c4, realizing that we can't play knight c2 because then they'll just take and just give us checkmate on f7. So obviously we don't want that. And so we're going to play the move of e6 instead. And it's actually kind of funny to see that we sort of have the same kind of position that we saw a bit earlier in the Dutch variation, but where we have the knight instead of the bishop on b4. I will admit, though, this is a better version for white, where, even though knight looks very nice on b4, there are a few other problems that can also arise, which I do want to mention. We could start with bishop c2 or play bishop d6, but I ultimately went with the move bishop e7 in my notes with the idea of meeting queen e2 and, trying to get that ideal sub with e4. Like, I think a position like this is just going to be very, very depressing. Like I mentioned before, how white having the center and our bishop just being stuck here is really what we're trying to avoid in the Slav defense with dc4. And so I think the move of bishop c2 is a much trickier one. And this is one actually I did analyze in a little bit of detail. So this next coverage is going to be a little bit more aimed at the more advanced players in that sense. But it is also the most unpleasant line for us objectively, so it is good to be ready for it. The move of knight a2 is the most common one, and that's going to where we're going to kind of start with this, because getting rid of the bishop does make a lot of sense. But after knight takes a2, I think the most common move in practice of queen c2 does really let us off the hook here. After knight takes c1, rook takes c1. So a very important move for black is that we want to, again, have that blockade over the queen side, to have the more flexible structure and not let white get such an easy kind of pawn push on us. And for that reason, it's going to be more precise to play a5 than to, let white kind of beat us to the punch and just leave us a little bit with a kind of passive version of a Catalan type position, if they even just grab space steadily where we're just very passive. So playing a5 and getting that sort of blockade on the queen side is quite important. And yeah, I'll admit that white probably does have a very small edge in a position like this, but I think it's also one we can defend quite solidly, like bring the knight to b4, put the pawns on the light squares to neutralize their bishop. And so the thing that I really like about this repertoire, it's one that a lot of the same ideas are kind of carrying over in different variations. So it's kind of, you see it once, but then you see it like five other times and you just carry that pattern with you, even in unfamiliar positions in your own games. So if they do play a funny move, you'll still know how to handle it and what you're really aiming for, as it were. Now I do want to mention there are some better moves for whites. I also looked at rook takes a2, which is the second most common move. But rook a2 I think is not the best way to take, because we have this little point that we can then play bishop e4 and bishop d5, and it really helps us a lot that they're not able to keep the minor pieces on the board, which is what they want to do when they have more space to leave us a bit more cramped because of the pin on the rook. And so again, a position like this, like it's somewhere between slightly better for white and equal. But I think as far as Slav positions go, you just have a very normal Slav position without, the usual body of theory attached to it. And I mean, you can even just sit on this position. Like, there's ways to, play it patiently, just developing. You can also look for the right time to hit back with c5. So you can again just use kind of the familiar Slav ideas that they're going to serve you well in other variations, and they're going to serve you well here also. The move that's the most unpleasant is going to be the move of bishop a2. That is the one that is going to give white an advantage. I sort of concluded that while objectively doesn't make a big difference, I do slightly prefer provoking a somewhat weakening f3 move before going back to g6. I just think that's a little bit more annoying from white's point of view. And I sort of concluded, yeah, you just want to get rid of that knight. And yeah, I mean, white does have the bishop pair in the space. So yeah, they are going to be better in a position like this. But I do think we kind of have enough ideas with like putting the rooks on the d file and maybe trying to get counterplay here. Then up to probably like a 2-300-ish FIDE level, you probably can sort of make this work. Maybe even up to 2-400-ish FIDE, because I've seen Gadakamsky play like worse versions of the Slav than this and even make it work against Grandmasters. But you can sort of see the idea, like the worst case is not like that bad for us in this case. It's a worse but still very playable position for black. There are some other moves they can play, which I'll go into a little bit more briefly by comparison. Like if they go a5, I just really like the move of knight d7, and it's a small smarty that we often prefer to play knight d7 before castles here. Because again, we're just very happy to trade the minor pieces. Like even just one trade of these pieces just gives our remaining pieces a lot more freedom. And I do think black is, more or less doing fine. Like any edge white has is just going to be very small. Whereas we have some very clear plans of, playing like castles, bishop g6, preparing e5 or c5. And yeah, that's just going to be. I mean, we're probably playing a little bit more for e5, c5 here, to be fair. But it's not too big of a problem to my mind. Bishop d2 is certainly a very natural development, clearing the square on c1 for the rook. But once again, if you can't remember the subtlety of playing knight d7 for castles, it is going to make your life a lot easier. And there was this computerish line I did analyze with e4, which I'm sort of reticent to cover it because it is a little bit computerish, but I think it is important to mention it because white does have this very creative idea of bishop d2 and trying to win the piece. But when I analyze, I did find that with f5 we are able to hold this position to a draw. The key point being that f3 actually doesn't win a piece directly because we do have the move of bishop to d6. And they can't take the bishop because then they run into this, and actually the king ends up getting mated as it turns out. Because if they go this way, we just have a very standard Damiano style checkmate with this square being covered. And if they go king e3, you just run into bishop c5 and you get a mate that way. Obviously, your opponent's not going to take on e4, but it's just so you understand why. Why this position is playable for black. Like in the end, I analyzed rook fe1, and I was getting this position where white was like a little bit better, but it was an endgame that you could hold essentially. The move of b3, I think, is a little bit harmless. Like it gives you even this option when they play this quietly, where you can just take your time to bring the bishop to safety before they can try to trap it in with e4 like we saw before. And again, I think this sort of structure is just going to be fine for black. Like you can trade off their knight here. You can prepare the c5 break. There's just a lot of flexibility in your position. According to the computer, the most annoying line is actually either knight a2 as mentioned or the move of e4. And e4 is a little bit of a tricky move. Like there are I will say, to be fair, it is something I think you're unlikely to face except against probably a very, very well prepared opponent, because knight 6 isn't really a trendy line at all these days. But there is the point after queen e4 that, the bishop can get kind of trapped here, which is obviously a bit of a problem. And so I'd suggest not taking the poison pawn, but just castling. And yeah, I mean, white does have an edge, but I think it's still, a normal kind of Slav position. Well, other than our bishop being kind of stuck, of course, that's, I guess, the rub a little bit. Now I think of it, actually, probably rook fc1 might be a little bit more precise than rook ac1, but it's going to be the same kind of position either way, to be fair, where, yeah, I mean, white's probably slightly better because of the having the two minor pieces for the rook and the pawn. So that does come to a bit of a material advantage, but I also think having the open file and, having moves to activate our pieces, yeah, we're slightly worse, but I think as a worst case, we can still make it work. There's enough imbalance and enough play, that our position still, fundamentally makes sense. But I hope with that, yeah, that kind of gives you at least the objective picture. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say that knight a6 equalizes when it doesn't. But I do think that you can see that, like, the payoff is very huge, that if white plays the most common moves in practice or makes just one natural move, they can easily end up in a very difficult position. And if they do know all the best moves, we end up with a slightly worse position that's still very much like a normal Slav, or we can still, play it safe and still have potential to outplay him in the middle game from there. So that's kind of, yeah, the idea behind knight a6. And if they do play something like knight h4, it's just going to basically transpose back into what we saw a bit earlier, like bishop b4, and, we were already looking at this position with like g6 and that sort of thing. And finally, if they do play bishop to g5, which I don't know how often you're really going to face it. It's not the most common move by any means, but I do think knight e4 is one quite nice response, which also sets a bit of a trap because most people will not play a move like e3, but they'll play a move like knight e4 because they just like exchanging. But in this case, to take is a bit of a mistake because if they play e3, which is what nearly everyone does, we actually have a little bit of a loose pieces drop off trick. So make sure to pay attention to this one. We can play to move bishop f3 first to leave the g5 bishop undefended. And now the move of queen a5 is a good fork to know in the Slav, where you can just win a piece. So if they put the bishop on g5, you're going to already start thinking about these kind of forks, winning a piece and just winning the game. And that really does cover the picture of a4 quite well. I do realize, yeah, that we've spent like a lot of time, like we spent an hour, just covering like the position after a4, bishop f5. But also, this is really the line that is the most unpleasant to face for a Slav player. So that means if you're happy with these kinds of positions, everything else is likely going to seem quite a bit easier by comparison, at the very least on an objective level. So with that, I do also want to touch on white's alternatives to a4, because like I said at the start of the video, you are going to face a few other things as well, right? And e4 is one you'll see probably about one in every 4 games or so. And what I've noticed, though, is that even though you'll face it quite a lot, that the way your opponents are usually going to play is just not going to be all that effective. And you can often meet in a very thematic way, like stuff such as, for example, e6, bishop e7, castle short, developing and preparing the c5 push. That's sort of an approach you're going to see in a lot of different variations. So I just want to mention this up here so that, when you see it come up over, you'll kind of ping you each time and it'll enter your long-term memory a lot more easily. So you can play like from, Grandmaster style play from long-term memory. The move e5 is the one that you'll see the most often, and even in Master Play, it actually was the most common until about probably 10 or 15 years ago. But just giving us this d5 square and a c-level platter, I think is just really, really nice for us. And a really cool point after a4 is that they're actually not really threatening to take that b5 pawn, technically. We can actually just ignore it, because now if they do take, again, white shouldn't really take, but it's not really clear what they're doing otherwise if they don't. But you'll notice that now we've solved the problem of our bad bishop. Previously it was stuck behind the structure, but now we have this wide open long diagonal. I think my wife is calling me right now, and yeah, I'm rather famously known for not like checking my phone that much. I mean, like if you're also neurodivergent, like you probably relate to the thing of like not always like answering your emails because it's like a bit too much like to talk to people. But yeah, after knight g5, they do have this fork of queen f3 to hit the pawn and the rook. Bishop e7 obviously avoids that. And if white does try to weaken our king, the thing is it's actually not that big of a problem because we haven't castled yet into their attack. That being said, this one, even though it's a more advanced move, this is one that it's a good one to note because if you notice, all the other moves are just really easy for black from there. But basically, bishop h6 bishop e7 rather is the move that really punishes white for their setup. I ended up saying h6 because that was like the second line of the engine to play pawn h6. But why help their knight go to e4? Like you can just play bishop e7, and if h4 h5, it's clear the attack just comes to a dead end in this case. Like in a position like this, white just has absolutely no counterplay, and our moves are just very natural and very strong. And if they do play bishop e2 instead and try to develop, then a really cool idea for black is to put the bishop on d5 first. That just really blockades, locks down the whole center. And in a position like this, I mean, pretty much everything is going to be winning or at the very least much, much better for black. Like for example, if you play like h4 or a5, like you're still going to be a lot better. So there just isn't really the compensation that white is was hoping for with their pawn sacrifice. It ends up being a bit nebulous here. Now there are some alternatives they can also play that I do want to mention really quickly. I will say with these kind of moves that like you're not going to face them as often. Like I wouldn't really try to commit these next lines to memory unless you're like already 2000 or 2200 plus. But I think it's still kind of good to see how the positions play out. Now, one of the things I kind of learned that I wasn't so familiar with before preparing this material is a4 is actually not as bad of a move as I would have thought. Because in this position, white does actually have some compensation with some of our pawns being a bit weak and white be able to try to use these sort of squares against us. And I think a very nice little shortcut here that is sort of approved by the engine is just to go knight d6. I mean, yeah, there are various moves you can play, like they're all going to give black a fine position. But I like this idea of just kicking their knight, their bishop, and just kind of making them choose a side. Because if they go this way, it also is nice to be able to, trade off your bad bishop before you play e6 and, shut it in, right? And if you take white playing the other way, bishop e3, in that case, I do like to move a5, just make sure that pawn's defended. They will usually castle so that bishop a6 runs into rook e1. You can play it with e6, you can play it with g6. Like, there's a lot of ways that black's going to be fine. And even though I did analyze this position a lot more deeply in the original notes, I think from here it's kind of enough to know that black is basically fine. Like, even if you don't know the details, you're still going to get a good position. So with that, if they do play bishop e2, that's actually going to be the most critical, and it's known as the Dubov approach, where, for example, if you play like bishop e7, white has some ideas like going a4 or b3 and then preparing an e5 push. There's some ideas like this that even though the engine will tell you that black is fine, it's like a little bit practically difficult to kind of go for this sort of thing as black. And for that reason, I think that the move of a5 and just grabbing the space is again going to be a lot more surprising for the opponent than bishop e7 or bishop e7. And it's a way, again, to kind of make the Slav our own, to find our own little way to put a spin on it, and put the opponent in a little bit unfamiliar territory, kind of echo the shortcut approach that I mentioned in the start of this video that, Grandmasters like to go for these days. And not just Grandmasters, but just really strong players in general. So one point of a5 is that you're basically playing a waiting move that kind of keeps that sort of waits to see what white's going to play, keeps them guessing a little, and then we can adapt our response based on how they play it. So for example, if they play a move like a4, well, now we can play b4, and basically, e5ing is playing knight d5, and we can get the knight in the center in a way that, also supports us to be able to go bishop a6 and hang on to the extra pawn. If they go b3, we can also play bishop to b4, and then a5 is just going to be a much more useful move compared to like the move of where the bishop went to b7. Because there are some positions where you can play like knight takes e4, and we can sort of play it like this, where you just kind of take the pawns and you're not, worried about this bishop coming in as much. You can sort of block it with this sort of thing. Is kind of the idea. But anyway, the move bishop g5 is the move I had as the main line. It is the one you can expect to face more so than any of the other ones. So we just break the pin, so we see the benefit of, keeping your flexibility with the bishop. Again, a4, bishop a6 just helps us to defend that extra pawn and keep our queenside structure very solid here. And if they do play e5, which is what usually happens, it might seem very natural for white to play this because they then get to try to exploit the weak dark squares. But the beauty of this is we can actually play around the knight when it gets to d6. Like they could play this first if they want to, but I'll just go with the move in the game of a4. Because if white waits too long, you can sometimes play a move like a4. That's kind of another idea of a5 I should mention, that you're just able to kind of fix this structure. So that if they do play b3, you can kind of just like open up the position in your favor with a protected pass pawn like this as such. I know this is just going to be an extra pawn for black at the end of the day. Now, if they play a4, we do actually have a really cool trick that, again, is probably going deeper into the weeds than is really necessary. It's really aimed definitely more at the title players and, quite advanced players. But here, a very cool move is the move of c3, setting up, a c takes b2, and it also has the point that if they do take the pawn, which is what most people do rather than, playing into these kind of positions. After that, we have knight takes c3, forking the queen and the bishop. And then after b4, you'll notice that white doesn't really get the usual kind of active play down the queenside files in the Benko style that they kind of hope for when they play this Dubov gambit. Because by playing a5 and then b4, you're just able to completely lock down that side of the board. Meaning that, yeah, you can just trade off your bad bishop, get in the c5 push, and it'll take some time, but you do basically have a decisive advantage here as black, with the extra pawn and the better knight in a sense, or the better outpost knight, let's say. And if they do play a move like queen c2, which is a move that Bluebaum was playing quite a lot on chess.com, it was kind of like his system against the Slav. It's kind of funny because I actually was thinking of covering it even in a white repertoire course in the future, and I may as well do so if there is a demand for it. But basically, here you have this move of b4, where if they do know this move of e5 to, avoid you just having a connected pass pawn and sort of the bone in their throat like this. Well, in that case, if they do, know the subtlety of e5 to avoid this kind of strategic damnation, well, that's fine. We can even just play the move at knight d5 and sort of following the Capablanca principle of meaning a gambit by finding the right way to first take the pawn, but then give the pawn back later just to have a really good position like this. There's no real need to take on f3, like just the bishop has just got a very nice diagonal here in general, whereas the double pawns aren't that big of a deal for white somehow. But I mean, yeah, you're just going to be better, like your knight can come toward the d5 outpost, and it's pretty clear, yeah, that the white doesn't really succeed in getting much of an attack going on the king side. Like even king h8 is a move just to, prepare to trap in the bishop in a very in a very thematic fashion that you've probably seen in other videos or other games in the past. Like yeah, even just rook g8 is one way to show off. But with that, that does I think cover the e4 spectrum of lines pretty well. If they do play e3, then again you can just keep your extra pawn. Although it is true that after a4, they are going to get it back here. But the rising position, like I said before, is just very pleasant for black. Like I kind of showed some of these ideas very briefly previously at the start of the video. But just to kind of give you a little bit of the picture of like how it looks in practice, you're basically going to be aiming for a position like this. Like you pretty much play this like almost no matter what they kind of do in a sense after knight a2. And once you get into c5, you can kind of see we have no bad pawns, no bad pieces. And I've already mentioned different versions of how, c5 is black's dream break in the Slav Defence, and that's obviously true in the bishop e7 setups as well. That obviously the bishop was kind of stuck on c8 after e6, but it's not not an issue any longer. So after rook fd1, like this, just showing you again the most common moves for white. And I do my own experience as a position that even though black is better, it is one that sometimes a few people are like, well, I'm not really sure what to do at this point to really kind of prove an advantage or a really good position. And so I want to mention that this move of cd4 and just releasing the tension is going to be more effective than just keeping the tension. Because whichever way they take, they're kind of giving away a little something. They're giving a bit of information. Like if they go knight bd4, well, we can then go knight e4, and this suddenly becomes a bit of a weakness for white on a4, right? Or ed4, bishop c6, suddenly becomes hard to defend that a4 pawn in a comfortable way. And if knight f takes d4, then just e5, and you're not really even concerned about knight f5. Like you just go bishop f8, and the knight is going to get kicked away anyway, while you still have your space advantage and more active pieces, and getting a little bit of a weakness to latch onto in a4. And if they do play knight f3, then yeah, just grab the space, and black is just going to be much better. You can see how horribly bottled up all of the white minor pieces especially are due to that lack of space. And so for that reason, it's probably better for white to play knight to b1 objectively. But then we can even play the move of bishop a6. It's kind of a more ambitious approach than, just playing like e6, which you definitely can still do this. It's just that you're not really kind of fighting for an advantage with this approach. And with the move bishop a6, you are able to ask white some trickier questions. Like if knight d2, you can go c3 to, make white work a little bit harder to get the pawn back. And if they play knight e5, which is the most common move on Lichess, the move e6 is just a really good reply, realizing that actually if they take with a knight, you just kind of go back to the normal setup I was showing a bit earlier, like just prepare the c5 break and you're going to be very comfortable. But if they do take with the bishop, well, let me ask you this. What do you think is going to be the move for black in this position here? So it's all about loose pieces drop off for this one. The knight's undefended, the pawn's undefended. Okay, the rooks are undefended, but it's a bit hard to get at them right now. So is there a way to attack both of those undefended pieces at once? Turns out there is. We can play queen to d5 and fork them just like that. And funnily enough, actually, this position is not as bad for white as actually I initially thought it would be. At the same time, it's also true that black, I think, is obviously going to be more comfortable having the extra pawn, and there's nothing too complicated about black's subsequent moves. So with that kind of explains why you don't really see e3 much at a high level. It's definitely a move you'll face a lot more at a club level, in my experience. But yeah, if they do play bishop g5, there's a lot of moves you can play. Like I'd originally recommended the move of b5 just very thematically, but I do think there is also merit to flicking in h6 first and putting the question to the bishop. Because if they do take, we just keep the extra pawn, and we are just basically a pawn up here. With the extra move b5 if needed to defend the pawn, say after knight d2, for example, it's just very safe for black with something like this. Opposite would be bishop b4, not pawn to b4. And if they do keep the tension, well, then the bishop just ends up a little bit offside on h4. And I mean, if they play e3, like again, you can just play the sap I showed before, like just this, and like you don't even really need to think about the moves. You're just going to have a better position with normal development. In again, the Moran style is what it is when you position the pieces in this kind of way, like I'm just showing here. And if they go e4, I just like playing the move of g5. Like there's no reason to really give them, some e6, e5 kind of, botvitic stuff. Like just break the pin and, just be a pawn up basically. I did analyze this a bit more deeply. Like it is true, bishop g5 is one of these moves that you're definitely not really going to see much in like opening books because it's just kind of a bad move for white. But I suppose it's one that you might see just often enough that is maybe worth showing you this really cool trick. If they play e5, you just go knight d5 or knight h5. Like either way, you're just going to be much better. Knight try, of course, being to grab their bishop pair and have that as well as the extra pawn. And also queen c2, like again, knight h5 is a nice way to trade off their bishop, and it also just keeps your king that bit safer with that bishop out of the way and having the unopposed dark square bishop defending the king. Like it definitely kind of has like Grunfeld shades, but where you're just a pawn up as such, like a pawn up Grunfeld. But the move a4 is a little bit of a tricky one that I did want to touch on. Because after a b4, so obviously we want to try and grab that e4 pawn, so they might try to counterattack. But the really cool computer shade here I found, and I'm not trying just for the opening, it's just a really instructive concept, is that actually the move e takes f6 is actually going to be better than knight takes f6. Now, if you forget and you play knight f6, you're still better anyway, but I just think it's a really cool concept that you can actually set a little bit of a trap here with the move f5. Because if they were to, let's say, to get out of this f4 trick, they play bishop d6. The really cool trap is that if they take the pawn, you just go knight b6, discovering the attack on both bishops, and you just win a piece. So that was kind of the really cool idea I just wanted to mention real fast before moving on to some of White's alternatives, when they don't bring out both the knights at once. So at this point, if we're looking at White's alternatives to knight f3, I already kind of mentioned how, White can try to bring the bishop out, or they can try to play e3, or play the exchange. Obviously, there's a few different ways that White can play it, but I did notice that actually bishop v5 was occurring in a very surprising 16% of games on the League Chess database, and I would imagine that probably the statistics are fairly similar on chess.com. It's a move that you're definitely going to see more at lower levels than higher levels. It's like the kind of move that a lot of opening course will just mention as an aside, but I do want to actually show you how you kind of punish these mistakes, because I do think that's a big part of how to improve at chess, is learning what mistakes are people making, people also including you, and not just like how to avoid those mistakes yourself, but like how do you punish the opponent's mistakes. That's the stuff that really gets me passionate about chess and chess coaching. Well, one of the many things, let's say. But the answer here is that we don't want to let white get a position like this, where the bishop is outside the pawn chain and, we just have a little bit of a passive position. Like, it's still playable, but it is a little bit better for white. And so the move dc4 is a much more effective thing. We don't want to let him get in the bishop out and get an e3. We do want to beat them to the punch, like we've kind of seen before. The move e4, it's the most common move, but it's not really a very good move, because after b5, we just have that extra pawn. And if they do play knight f3, it's going to transpose kind of to what we were looking at just before with like g5 and all that. But if they play a4 instead, so this is actually the most common line for white after bishop g5, so you can definitely expect to see it a lot. Again, especially if you're like below 1600 at 2000. But the move b4 is basically a refutation, because obviously allowing that pawn to get taken and even losing a second pawn is not really why white played this, let's put it like this. But if they do take the knight, we have this little intermezzo where we can flick in b takes c3 and attack two things at once. I mean, in a position like this, it's just lights out for white. You've got two extra pawns, even connected passes, and white is just completely lost, essentially. So that's not really a problem at all. There are other moves white can play, like e3 is sort of the main one that you will tend to see. But after b5, we can kind of go for a setup like I sort of showed before, where the Moran setup, in case you remember that one. But you might also be wondering, well, Max, what if white plays a4 here? So making the point you don't have bishop b4 yet to break that, to deal with the threat more aggressively. Well, maybe I can pass it over to you. What would be your continuation as black in this case? So in my experience, when the move of b4 or a6 is not so effective, because if you play like b4, a difference you'll notice compared to the like knight f3 lines is that their bishop is outside the pawn chain, and I mean you can still play this, but like a6 for example, you are running into some pins, and I realize like some of these tactics will be a bit basic for some of you watching, but it's just to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page here. But this does explain why the move queen b6 is going to be more effective, and again you can kind of see that Moran style setup that we're going for. It's sort of interesting to see that most people were actually playing the move of a takes b5, which I think is just going to be a strategic mistake, because your pawn gets undoubled and it just gives you a really nice long diagonal for your bishop when you do eventually put it on b7. We will see that actually, black can even just delay the move of bishop b7 if you really want to punish their move order. But there was also a cool trick I wanted to show of like even accelerating the queenside play with bishop b4 and a5. Kind of like a node boom, like a semi-Slav with c6, dc4, in case you know that one. So it would be something like if I were to go back some moves, and if we play say like e6, like this would be the node boom system. If you do want kind of a comparison, you end up getting a position like this where you end up giving up. You end up like having to give back the pawn, but you get this really nice play with the connected pass pawns on the queen side. So again, it's something that I may end up covering in a future video if there's a demand for how to play these triangle types of positions, because they can lead to some very interesting play. But that's kind of what I'm reminded of when I see a position like this. But because they played this move of bishop g5 that's a bit too slow, it means that they just don't get the pawn back now after b3. We just, or a b5, we just take, and, we basically get that note boom type position, but where we're just a pawn up instead of, white having their assets. And if they do play a quieter bishop e2, yeah, you can just play bishop e7, just develop normally like we saw before. You're not really that concerned about bishop f6, like you still are able to even just keep the king in the center and it's still going to be reasonably safe. But yeah, that is a way like they can play it as well, to be fair. But in all cases, black is going to be very, very comfortable. And if they play a4, which is probably one of the better ways to try to not just be worse as white. But then there's this interesting idea of playing queen b6, where you can kind of lure the queen to d2 and then play queen a5, which looks very strange compared to the immediate queen a5, but it does have the logic that you're preparing to move b5 and they can't take because of the rook being undefended, which obviously wouldn't be the case with queen on d1. But that is really a bit more of an advanced point, so yeah, it's not really one you need to remember to make this work as black, because not a whole lot of people play a4 anyway at this point. So in any case, we can kind of see from that why bishop g5 is just not that effective, and it's just going to give black a small advantage, in my opinion. Now, the next couple of lines that I'll be showing are actually the ways that I like to play against the Slav as a junior. Like the first system I played against the Slav was basically just going cd5 because I just wanted to get a simple position and not have to calculate what happens after d takes c4. Then around 2004, when I was like 11 to 12 years old, I started to play this e3 move. And I'm going to cover the e3 move first because I think it is one that's a little bit more annoying for a lot of Slav repertoires. I mean, the exchange can also be annoying in its own ways. We'll talk about that a bit later of, how to be able to keep winning chances and keep the game going. But e3 has the idea that if you play the move of e6, for example, which is kind of the way that most people play it as black, then white goes knight f3, and you've basically been move on into the semi-Slav, which something I probably should have mentioned a bit earlier in this video is that basically when you play the Slav, like there's a semi-Slav, and the way we're kind of looking at it is more the classical Slav, where you're playing more classically, like try to, keep the bishop's diagonal open, this kind of thing. It's also sometimes called the mainline Slav when you go knight f3 dc4, but quite clearly taking doesn't really make so much sense when it can just take back directly. So this really is aimed against our repertoire quite clearly. And again, if bishop f5, you probably remember this idea of how it takes, and queen b3 is kind of annoying. And I mean, to be fair, you can still make this work. I can still play this 21st century gambit, and still have quite good play for the pawn. But I just felt that this maybe wouldn't be as much in the spirit of the repertoire as what I had in mind. Because like you have to sort of remember quite a few different details, and like if you forget, you can end up in a bit of a rough position as black. So I decided to go with a line I actually have had a bit of a soft spot for over the last year in the Schlecter Slav of g6. Because I used to think that the Schlecter was just slightly better for white. You just kind of had a poor person's Grunfeld where, you played c6 instead of the more aggressive Catalan style c5. But there is actually a lot of flexibility to black setup. And when I noticed that a lot of quite strong GMs like Garakamsky from the US and also many of the top Chinese grandmasters from the 2000s like Wang Yue, Bu Zhangji, and many others like that, I noticed that I think that they were kind of onto something with having a system that gives you that kind of flexibility of just kind of getting a long game, like a long strategic position about needing to know a whole lot of opening theory, but where you could also very easily pick between different systems to kind of keep the opponents guessing and try to get the kind of position that you want. Because as you can see from even just the arrows here, there's actually a lot of very playable moves that black can go for. For this particular video, I mean, the Schlecter is something I might return to in the future. I do feel like it's a sort of topic that probably fits better for a course than for YouTube, but we'll see what happens and what the demand is for it. But I've gone with the move bishop g4 because I think it's just the one that's the most natural. Is have this very clear plan of just recycling your bishop and kind of building it like a semi-Slav, but where you don't have the bishop stuck inside the pawns. So I think that's a very natural way of playing it. There are some other approaches there that are also quite interesting. Like modern engines kind of have a few interesting ideas. Like, for example, you could also play bishop e6 is one that's not so common, but actually the engine kind of likes it. Also moves such as knight e4 or some of the more common moves historically have been moves like a6 and moves like b6, just kind of preparing the very solid thematic stuff like this one. And there's even other moves like rook e8 or knight bd7. You sort of get the point. There's just going to be so many quite playable moves for black. Okay, I didn't even mention a move dc4, which is one of the old main lines actually at this point. So then you kind of get the idea. There's just so many different moves that you could play, and it means you could really play the Schlecter Slav for your whole life. Because if there's one move you're playing that either opponents are kind of ready for, or if you just are not a fan of positions, you can very easily find another move that you can play. That being said, I do think Bishop G4 is a very good first system, because like I said, the ideas are very clear and thematic. You want to recycle your bishop that would otherwise be a bit stuck behind the pawns. And the ideas, I think, it is very clear. So if they play H3, which is, I think, the move you can really expect to see the most often by a small margin. If you're a more advanced player, you're going to see CD5 a bit more, but we will get to that in due course. Because A3 is really not such a bad move for black. Like after white after takes, if black takes the pawn, white does actually get a lot of compensation, and I do think the pressure is a little bit unpleasant for black in a position like this. Like you can still make it work, but I just think that from a human point of view, it's just much easier to just play e6, and again, kind of approach we've seen a lot of times in this video, is that theme of playing against the opponent's light squared bishop and putting our pawns on the opposite color complex to our remaining dark squared bishop. And when I was looking in the database, I was kind of surprised actually to see like how poorly white was often playing positions like this below the 2,200-ish level. And I think it's just that, you just have a very clear like theme, like your piece go to natural squares, and white just doesn't really know what to do with their space and bishops. Because, like, let's think, like, if you're looking at it from White's point of view, you're probably thinking, well, the engine says White's a tiny bit better with the space and the bishops, so I'll just figure it out as I go along. But when you kind of have that, like, bit extra experience, bit better understanding the positions, and also just a very clear plan where you have the easy decisions and they have all the tough decisions, it makes it very easy for the opponent to outplay themselves. And I'm going to give two examples to show you what I mean. So the most common move by far online is actually the move of c takes d5. Again, if you're playing at like 2000 plus FIDE level, you'll probably see b3 more, and we will get to that in a moment. But CD5 is just going to be a little bit of a strategic mistake, because again, in the exchange Slav, we really love to get the knight on c6, and we also still keep that bishop just very passive on f3. It makes sense, of course, that we want to keep the structure a little bit more symmetrical, whereas they want to make it more asymmetrical when they've got the bishop pair advantage. So we're just keeping a structure more fixed, making it hard for them to open things up for the bishops, because you can kind of see here they're not really able to open it with e4 so easily due to the pressure against the d4 pawn. And even if e4 wasn't just losing a pawn, like that pawn would still be a bit of a long-term weakness. And after rook ac1, you do want to be a little bit careful here. Like, you want to play rook fc8 and just kind of build up steadily, like rook c7, rook c8, a6, b5. And you want to be a bit careful with the timing of knight a5, even though it's a move that obviously strategically would be very nice. Again, loose pieces drop off, and you've got to watch out for the tactics. Knight d5 is going to win a pawn here. So, yeah, please don't fall for this, thanks. So going back a bit, if we do go to this position after e6, yeah, a move like b3 is definitely a lot more healthy for white, and to my mind, a lot more natural. I would suggest just playing rook e8 or knight d7. Like, the move's kind of interchanged, to be fair. But with this move order, yeah, you do have some like extra options like queen a5 that can be a little annoying. So usually they do put the bishop just on b2, and I mean the position is just very solid. Like, even if you just play moves like a6 and h5 and just kind of sit on this position, it's actually very hard for white to break through. I remember actually that Australia's like top player in the past, Anton Smirnov, he actually would just kind of play this approach. Like, he was kind of doing it more against the flank openings like knight f3, g3 stuff, to be fair. But this is basically like how he'd win a lot of games against GMs on chess.com. Like, he just get this position, just shuffle the pieces around, run them low on time. And then when they got low on time, like he would just pounce on the tactic and win. And it was so annoying like to play against, but it was also just so effective. And that's kind of what we're doing here. But I want you to know that we also can play a little bit more ambitiously as well. Like say if they go Queen D2, just saying, well, okay, I'm just going to put my queen on whatever square. This move E5 is an interesting sort of tactical idea because it looks like you're sacrificing a pawn, but actually you do have this move of E4, and if they do take on C6, you kind of have some tricks where like you meet GF3 with Queen H3, and I think Black has very good practical chances because you definitely are making a very clear point that their king is a lot weaker than ours, which is from a human point of view rather difficult for White to deal with. Like the engine will say it's equal, but it's definitely a lot easier to play Black here. But if they go Bishop E2, well then we just take with the knights. And in this position, you just kind of have this little reversed French or reversed Catalan type position. Where, your bishop can just come around here, even you can try to attack if they play a bit carelessly. But at the end of the day, this is probably the worst case scenario. And even here, I think White only has a very, very small advantage in this position. So again, our worst case is really not too bad in this instance. Um, so yeah, and E5 is not the only move. Like you can also just sit and wait, but I just have a feeling E5 is probably the move that'll give you the better practical results because it kind of clarifies the position a little bit more for those of you who want that. But yeah, the choice is yours at the end of the day, how you want to play it. Because yeah, the engines, it's kind of funny, like the engines disagree a little, but the difference is like 0.001, which just doesn't really matter. Now going back to this position, so the move of the CD5 is actually kind of is going to be a better one in this case compared to after H3 has been played. Because the move of Queen B3 is going to be a little bit of an annoying one, where one thing actually I do want to mention just before I move on to the CD5 line is that if they do play B3, there is a cool move of knight E4 that is an option if you just want to trade off some pieces. But if you also just play something like E6, like you also can just transpose back into some of the lines we were looking at before, and that's also going to be totally fine, of course. But knight E4 is a move that does make your life a little bit easier if you know it beforehand. But after CD5 and Queen B3, so we can kind of see that if White goes Queen B3 first, that then we have the extra option of Queen B6. Because if they try to win a pawn, we have this intermezzo where we're able to take with the knight, or with the pawn. Like both moves are going to be fine. Like 95 is probably more the move if you want to keep winning chances, whereas CD5 is going to be a little bit more than just play for a solid draw kind of option. If they do play B4, then you might put a knight on D7 just not to run into some knight C6 B5. But okay, these are admittedly more subtleties for let's say players rate over 2000. But that does explain a little bit why like CD5 and Queen B3 is a little bit more critical because now Queen B6 Knight D5 does in fact win a pawn for White with this knight takes E7 intermezzo. And so we should just play the move of B6 instead. And move H3 is what you're usually going to see because Bishop D2 does give us some options like Knight E4 that does give us some good counterplay as it turns out. And it's a theme you'll notice a lot. This Knight E4 is a really good square for our pieces, for our knights in the Schlecter Slav in different versions. So it's a good middle game idea to know. And if they do play H3, we do have a little bit of a choice where I do remember that actually in the past, like about would have been 15, 16 years ago, I did think that Bishop C8, B7 was quite a cool idea. Just kind of bring the bishop back. Modern engines do think it's a little bit too slow though, and for that reason I think it's better just to trade off the bishop. And again, just kind of build that solid light squared center against their unopposed bishop, like we've been talking about before. Now, I will admit that probably from a computer perspective, I mean, to be fair, like White does, I think, have a small edge with the bishops and with the bishop pair. But we also do have a solid position with no weaknesses, and I do think that probably this move order is going to be a little bit more precise of a way of doing things. But in my original notes, I kind of covered the move of knight c6 just because it's kind of the easier one to like understand for like 99% of players. And also if they play rook ac1, like you just get queen a5 and you just get this very comfortable equality. Because kind of the reason that you want to play rook fc1 rather than rook ac1 is so that white can play a move like bishop e1 without shutting in the rook. So it's a subtle but kind of a good sort of distinction to make here. Because in this version, white is going to have a small advantage when they play the move of bishop to e1, because then our knight is just going to be a little bit stuck. And yeah, it's also good, like when you're looking at black openings, obviously to see like what white's trying to do. That white does have a bit of an edge with the control over the sort of this square being a little bit annoying. Like if you go deep enough with the computer, yeah, it does turn out black can probably gradually equalize. But like I said, you can look into the queen c7 and doing it this way, and that's going to avoid some of those annoying options for white that I just mentioned as such by developing the other pieces before the knight and the a8 rook. So that's really the worst case scenario though. Like if you're happy with a position like this, you really can play the Schlecter with a lot of confidence pretty much for your whole life because it's not the sort of system where you're going to be in a lot of trouble if you forgot some theoretical move because it's just a much more strategic kind of system. Now, I do want to also touch on what happens after some alternatives, like what if they play the move of bishop d3, which seemingly it's more active than the move of bishop e2. But as you can kind of see here, when you're sort of, and I kind of call this one the Georgian principle, that when you attack a pawn that's defended twice, it just makes the bishop a very ineffective piece on that diagonal. And once again, the move bishop g4, I think, is just a very good move for black here, where we can just play in a very similar way to what we just saw of, play the pawns against their unopposed bishop, and then just develop naturally from there, like knight d7 and rook e8. I did go actually a bit deeper into this in my notes, and I'm sort of debating how deep I want to go into this video, but I will leave you with one cool trick that I will share, because a lot of players have fallen into it in the online games, even at a fairly high level. So after b3, bishop b2, yeah, I mean, there's various moves. Like you can play rook e8 and you can play queen a5, but I do think that rook e8 is kind of the more easy move to understand with sort of e5 and you're trying to get the fork going against the queen and the bishop if the knight goes to e5. And for that reason, a lot of players as white actually like to play the move of e4 for some reason, rather than just going for that more slower kind of play like this, which it's a bit easier for white, but I do think black is fundamentally fine in various ways. Like even b5 is a way you can try and create some counterplay as an alternative to the e5 plan. But e4 is one that is a little bit of a trap that we can really take advantage of. I was kind of surprised actually how many even quite decent players were falling into this as white in online games. But the answer here is this is your cue to pause the video, by the way, if you want more time to think about it. But the point is that we actually have a very strong move of e5 that is actually going to be much better for black, because if white were to take, we are going to basically win a pawn up. Like, yeah, you can even play knight takes d3, and there's various ways to do it. Like, taking here is probably the simplest one to understand. Black's just up a pawn, and if white goes ed5 instead, you've got this little e takes d4 intermezzo that now if they do play a move like d takes c6 to, avoid some like 94, 95 fork that is just pretty bad for white. Instead, after dc6, you have the move knight e5, where it's able to fork the queen and the bishop. The knight on c3 is also under attack, so white just ends up being, completely dead lost in this case. So that's a good trick to know, showing how you can even, again, use the opponent's force against them, like I was kind of talking about before. If they play cd5, like we've kind of already seen how, this kind of symmetrical structure is just going to be very healthy for black. And I like trading bishops, just to kind of get rid of a piece that we were kind of recycling earlier anyway. If they play queen b3, I would just go e6 is probably the simplest. If takes, you are able to cover the pawn, so it's not really going to be a problem for black in any sort of shape. And if they do play bishop d7, which is kind of the normal move, I do like playing queen d7 even with the loss of tempo in knight e5. Because it turns out that, our knight really does belong on c6 in a structure like this. It would just be very passive on a square like d7 by comparison. You can also play queen c7 like that. That's totally fine as well. The queen e6 is a little bit more ambitious. That after knight b5, yeah, we're kind of baiting them to to attack our queen, but it just ends up being a bit of a one-move attack, like Luke Skywalker misusing the Force. So a4, knight c6. Our pieces just go to very, very natural squares, and you can see that their bishop is stuck. They've got some weaknesses on the queen side. And if they do take... So these are the most common moves for white, but actually three small mistakes that white has made over the last three moves. Is now after c5, we are just ready to just kind of open up the position and just have this really good reverse Grunfeld, where they don't have the pressure against our center, but we do have those weaknesses against the a5 and b2 pawns that give us a very, very pleasant advantage. And finally, let's just say if they do play a move like h3, which it's not a move you're really going to see very much, but I do just want to quickly show what to do if they do play h3 and stop bishop g4. And when they play some really slow move like this, a kind of nice option to my mind is just to play c5 and transpose kind of into a Grunfeld, where this extra move at d3 does h3 is sort of not that big of a problem for us. That being said, the move with c5 I think does require kind of a good understanding of some other position types, like some Catalans and some reverse Tarrasch QGDs to make it work. So if you do want a lazier option, it is sort of the way the engine wants to play it. You can also play to something like takes and b5, and you just play in the kind of Moran style again. We just push for c5, and well, it's a bit of a weird looking Moran to have the bishop on g7 and e7. It does still technically work, so yeah, there's nothing really to worry about with that. Like if they play a move like b4, trying to stop the move of c5, well, it kind of opens the door for other things like a5 to go after him like that, or even knight b6 if you want to try to exploit some of those weaknesses on the light squares. But either way, black's just going to be totally fine here, so nothing too much to fear. And with that, I'm going to now move to the other sort of major alternative to knight f3 and e3 in the exchange variation. And this one is going to be a bit of a deep coverage. I really did go into a lot of depth in these lines. First, because they can arise from different move orders, like they could play, c takes d5 immediately, or they could play knight f3 and then c d5. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of get to these sorts of positions. But also there's a kind of a bit of a practical point to it as well, as I just get my bearings again. And that is that one of the main reasons a lot of players don't play the Slav as black is because they think, well, I can just play the exchange and just make it a boring equal position, but it's going to play for a draw. But the thing is that there are different ways of playing it as black where you can make the position a bit more spicy. And actually, when I was playing the exchange Slav as white, I was actually playing it very much for a win. So it is actually a system white can play also quite ambitiously. But also after knight f3, knight c6. And I've sort of been surprised actually like how often in my online games that white just sort of hasn't really played very critically, or just kind of played very passively from the outset. So something I noticed when looking at the online database of billions and billions of games is that even though bishop f4 is the best move, the move of bishop g5 is actually nearly as common, and I will be showing how to deal with that a little bit later, but I'm going to start with the move of bishop f4, because it is one that, yeah, is a more critical one, and there's actually a few different ways that we can deal with it. In this particular, course I prepared, I basically went with a move of bishop f5, which I will say that if you are in like a must-win game against an opponent and you're like rate 1800 or 2000 plus, that you might want to look at some alternatives such as the move of a6, like in the Trebenenko style, going for this kind of thing like bishop g4, and kind of like we saw in the Schlecter actually, where you sort of recycle the bishop in some lines, say after h3, and just play to kind of use that bishop versus knight imbalance to kind of play for a win here. Another approach also that I was kind of playing when I was first playing the Slav around 2009 was this move of knight to h5, which I think is also a very interesting approach. We can kind of go like e6 and try to play a little bit like a sort of stonewall with as such. And yeah, it's one that also has quite a decent reputation from Black's perspective. So there's some directions I might explore if you're in like a must-win game as a more advanced player. But in this particular training, I'm going to focus more in a similar spirit to what I've covered before, that we're not going to really try to create like some massive like imbalance and, make things really crazy. We're just going to play like very solid and steady chess. saying it, okay, if white just plays a good moves every move, then it's a draw, and we kind of accept it. But also realizing that even in a symmetrical position, there are still ways to to still make it kind of interesting. So e3, e6, this is where white does have quite a broad choice, and we are going to cover a bunch of the options. So the move bishop d3 is the one you'll really see the most often. It's kind of funny actually in over the board play. Like I don't know how many of you know about like the idea of prearranged draws, which are technically not allowed, of course, to prearrange or fix the results. But it does happen before, where, like players will say, "Okay, we'll make a draw," and they just play bishop d3. They, take and they play something like this, like just take castles, swap off the pieces, and then they just agree a draw at some point, when they just got sick of playing and keeping up, the pretense that they're playing a game. But of course, for a lot of you watching, I think you are going to be wanting to, get a position and, you play chess not to make a quick draw, but, to try to outplay the opponent, try to outsmart them. And for this reason, I quite like the idea of playing bishop e7, just a way to kind of keep those bishops on the board, like having, obviously, the bishops, you kind of black's going to make the argument that just in a structure like this, that we have kind of the better bishop in the long term because of the pawns being on the same color complex as their bishop. And while that's objectively not such a big problem because their bishop's outside the pawn chain, it is a way in which we can play for a win here. And there's also ways to also go knight h5 and trade off their bishop and have again that bishop versus knight imbalance. So I really do believe the position like this is one that actually does give good scope for the stronger player to outplay, especially if you're black. There are a few other alternatives, like a move like knight h5 immediately is also quite interesting if you just want to get rid of their bishop more directly. Also, bishop b4 is another way to try to imbalance the position, which, yeah, I mean, it's also going to be technically fine. We just go for the bishop versus knight imbalance at some point. So there's a lot of good options, but I think the main thing is just to kind of have a decent feel of how the positions kind of play out in a sense. Because let's say white plays a3, we just go with the most natural move. In this case, you'll notice if we ask the question of what squares were left behind, well, now the light squares are even weaker for white. They have one pawn that's still on a light square. And so we can take what the opponent gives us very kindly, knight to a5, preparing to bring the knight to this dream square of c4. Like when it comes to these symmetrical positions, it really comes down to can we get our knight to c4 before they can get the knight to c5? And if we do that, we're going to be the one with all of the momentum here. Like if they go rook ac1, you can kind of see how it's hard to get rid of that knight because b3 would then drop the pawn on a3. So it's kind of these little small subtleties that just make things can make things a little bit practically difficult for our opponent, yeah. But as it so happens, if they do play knight e5, continuing the idea of take what the square that was given, well then we just go rook c8, and we still have ideas of putting the knight on c4. Obviously, yeah, rook fc1, knight b3 is a tactic that white really should be avoiding. But if they play the move of b4, which is kind of the most common one in this position for white, I'm just like adding a variation to the file just for reference, just like kind of like you know remember to cover it like for people later on in case I turn some a full course, for pay. But after b4, the problem is that now the c4 square is not just a good square, it's not just a semi-outpost, but it's just a full outpost. And question for you all, after knight takes c4, what would be your way of recapturing as black? So it turns out both moves are actually good here. Both of them will give you an advantage, but actually d takes c4 is going to be the more effective one because it gives you that very powerful passed pawn, and after knight d5, white's really going to struggle to find a great plan when we get that protected passed pawn with like knight c3 and b5 and such. There's also even moves like a5 as well. We can kind of show up that white does have some more weaknesses in their structure. So, it's just going to be a much better position for black. And I think a really good example of seeing how white can end up in hot water in this position, even with quite natural moves, which is not something you would really expect looking at it, but it's just, again, using those light squares to our advantage. Because if you think about the Slav is more of a light squared strategy, right? We go d5, c6, bishop out f5, it's all on the light squares. kind of like an opening like the French or the Caracan that are also very light squared systems. Whereas something like, say, King's Indian Defense or Sicilian, yeah, is more of a dark squared strategy, or, of course, e4, e5. If they do play Rook FC1, I would probably just go Knight h5. Like, any move is going to be fine pretty much, but just getting rid of that bishop does give you a little bit of imbalance to play for a win. And if they play h3 trying to avoid Knight h5 by making some luft for the bishop, then you can just play Queen b6 and just play with the pieces. Like, you sort of know the plan by now of bringing the knight to c4. I think it should be pretty familiar to you. There's also moves like knight e4 as well, where you try to unbalance the structure that way and get some small chances. But, black is the one who is fighting for an advantage at this point, because we're a bit faster on the queen side than white. So with that, that really shows that, the line that I think most people are most concerned about in terms of white playing for a draw is bishop d3, but, we absolutely can successfully play for a win there. A move like bishop e5, you'll probably see about 1/4 of your games. And it's probably a good idea to remember this move of knight d7, because it just takes the sting out of bishop knight to e5, which can be a bit annoying sometimes. And, by breaking the pin, it just allows us to essentially develop with impunity. I kind of like playing the move of rook c8 more so than castles, because after castles you can end up facing a little bit of a wide initiative on the queen side, whereas by playing rook c8 you're not really as concerned about knight to a4 anymore, because if they do play a move like knight a4, a3, you've got some fun ideas with g5 where you can kind of use this h file actually as a hook for the attack and get some really good play down the h file against their king. Again, you can sort of see these ways of spicing up the position like so. And if they do play a move like h3, then yeah, the move a6 is kind of a nice way to put the question to the bishop. Like if they go to a4, you can even just castle and, your position is just very sound. And I mean, you're also going to play b5 and even use the bishop as a hook to, to kind of get your strategy in on the board. And if they do play bishop d3, like it's kind of clear you just got a better version of some of the positions we saw just a moment ago that, you're just going to bring the knight to c4 and just exert that pressure over the long term. This kind of explains why the move queen b3 is really considered the more critical one. And, if you are playing this at a very high level, like 2000 plus, this is probably the move you can expect more. The move of bishop b4 is objectively the best one, but I will say that if you are in a must-win game, that you might potentially prefer to play queen b6, even though it does give white a very small edge, because it does at least give you that bit of an imbalance in the structure to work with, and so that's also an alternative worth mentioning. But bishop b4 is the move that will be the reliable equalizer for black. White usually plays bishop b5, because after knight e5, even though this is a line that you will see a fair bit as well at more high levels, you can play this bishop takes c3 move and just kind of use your lead in development to your advantage, and use the fact that their king is not yet safe, and trying to take the pawn can lead them in a little bit of hot water here with moves like knight e4 and stuff as well if they're not careful. So a move like f3 to stop that is more solid, but then we do have solutions like knight d7 and now kind of there's this cool computer idea where you go like h5 and really try to exploit the weakness of the bishop. I mean, this is definitely, I'm showing it's definitely more for the more advanced students, but still some of these ideas are kind of interesting. We go like queen a5 and just really not give white the time to fully consolidate their position, and move like e5 is also an idea that you don't need to know it. Like any move is going to be fine for black pretty much, but it's definitely the sort of thing that can kind of set some problems to the opponent. We have some tricks like this up your sleeve to try and take control of the game. And yeah, I mean, in a position like this, I think black just has the better side of equality. Like rook b6 is a very annoying threat to threaten to win the a2 pawn, and like black just has a better flow of piece activity in this kind of position, like this, for example. So that kind of explains why bishop b5 is the more common move and the one that you'll tend to see more at like just in general. But in this case, we can just play like you can castle. You can play bishop c3 first. It is just going to basically transpose at the end of the day. But there was a really cool idea I did want to show at this point, because the most common move in the database is to play rook c8. But then what's going to happen is you're going to end up with this this very sort of dry endgame after bishop g4, and I think there was even like a game in Kramnik and Nan's like World Championship match game one where they sort of had a they ended up having some endgame where Kramnik was up a pawn and Anand held the draw about too much trouble, but it's also pretty obvious that only white can really ever win from a position like that. And so I think it's just much more practical to go knight e4 and just play it a lot more dynamically, realizing if they do try to hang on to the bishop, the queen a5 is going to be a rather embarrassing situation for white. So white really should play queen a3 to cover queen a5. We take the bishop, and castling is pretty normal. If you are looking for a system against the Slav, I do think knight e5 is a very interesting idea that you might like to explore in your own time. Like the engine gives 0-0-0, but it is a little bit tricky. But castling is the move you're obviously going to see a lot more often. And at this point, I think what we want to be careful of is we want to avoid a position where white is just able to just kind of focus fire on our pawn, and we're just left passively defending. Like for example, a move like Queen B6 is already just going to just put us in a lot of hot water. Like they're going to kick away our knight, they'll just blockade here, and our position is going to really suck. So for that reason, we should play more dynamically with G5. And this was something I didn't even really know about this kind of idea until I was preparing it for a course. But I found this really interesting novelty of Rook to C8, which is kind of a bit of a weird looking move compared to playing like F6 or H5, which is a bit more obvious. H5 does run into H4. That is a little bit of an annoying move for black to deal with, at least on a practical level. But with the move of Rook C8, it's kind of a bit different now, where we're actually going to be having really good compensation if they take our pawn sacrifice. And we're not really going to be doing anything too crazy. Like we're just going to be very patient and just go Rook F7 and kind of just make the point that these pieces just aren't really involved in the battle on the queen side. So yeah, I'll admit it's a very deep kind of idea, but if white does play a natural move like Bishop H2 to avoid the degradation of the king side structure, well, we can go Rook F7 and C5, and believe it or not, it's actually going to be a position that the engine does think is better for black. Like if they take, for example, you'll kind of see that again their knight and bishop is completely dominated by our structure, whereas we do have some very nice active piece play and initiative to work with. So it's a more advanced idea that you might like to try it in your own games. I do. It's one that, at least for me, it's something I would, if I was still playing like tournaments. I'd be really keen to get something like this on the board because it's the kind of thing where a lot of white's most natural moves just kind of backfire for them in different ways. Whereas black's plans are sort of fairly clear and systematic. So with that, if white does play queen to b3, by the way, it's going to end up transposing into a variation I'm going to be covering via a different move order, with white playing bishop f4 on move 5. So we are going to get to that a little bit later on. So going back a bit to this position here. So I did mention before that bishop to g5 is far and away white's most common alternative. And is a move where if white is able to sort of get into e3 and kind of get the pieces out, you can sort of make the argument that a pin like this can be a little bit annoying. Say if you play like e6, for example. I think from memory, this is like from many months ago that I checked it, but I think I remember that e6 is kind of the most common move that black was playing like in online games, and white was kind of getting a small advantage with quite natural moves, because obviously their queen's bishop is a lot more active than ours here. But a much better approach here, kind of like in the Torre attack actually for black, is going to be to play knight to e4. Because if they take our knight, we just end up having this attack on the knight and also on the pawn that is obviously very annoying for white, right? So more often white will play a move like retreating the bishop. For example, bishop to f4 is what I have as my main line here. And here I actually have a really cool idea that, again, I didn't even really notice was a thing until I started preparing like this very seriously. But it turns out f6 is a very tricky move because your opponent is most likely going to play e3 without really thinking because that's just the automatic move to play. But it's actually a little bit of a mistake here. Because of an idea that I've actually shown a few different versions before. Like, if you've ever played Jabava London, you'll kind of know this idea that when they bring the bishop out, we can just go for the pawn storm and whatever way they try to deal with this h4 and this like this kingside Noah's Ark trap on the bishop, it's going to be a concession. Like whether they go h4 or h3, we're still going to be very much messing up their pawn structure, right? Like after h3, take, take. I like to move queen d6, just develop with tempo, make them either lose the pawn or in this case give up the right to castle. And I think here we don't have to necessarily rush with h4. Like there's nothing wrong with it, but I think we can also benefit from just being a bit more patient and kind of in the Slav style, just letting them stew in their own juices. Maybe get a few of the piece to better squares and then think about h4 for the attack. So it's kind of like we're still going to attack. We're just going to prepare it when more of our pieces are kind of in formation, rather than just being, like a rabid dog, and just like going for the person right away, like without thinking it through. But yeah, if white plays a3 instead, that is a better move to meet g5 with bishop d2. But you can see the plan still works pretty well for black. They just have like very natural development, and it's not really easy for white to kind of take advantage of the king side pawn moves because the position is a little bit too close and white's just a little bit too passive for that. So that's one really cool idea. And if they do play bishop h4 to try to keep the pin on the pawn, believe it or not, that's actually going to be a bit of a mistake. Actually, something I kind of just realized that I didn't even think of before, but you could also play h5 and get something very similar to what we were just looking at, and that's actually probably a more practical approach than what I had originally recommended. Like the line I'd recommended was queen a5, but you sort of have to find some kind of computerish moves to make it work. And so I think h5, yeah, it's just going to be a lot more human for just transposing back in that familiar territory, yeah. So as you can see, though, bishop g5 just doesn't really have the desired effect. Like black already is the one fighting for an advantage in a position like this one. So with that, if they do play, there is also a move e3 that I see in a few strong players play, but I'm going to cover it via a different move order a little bit later on in the video, closer to the end. So going back here, what if they play a move that's not knight f3? Like what if they try to benefit from delaying or even potentially avoiding this knight to f3 move? So the move of bishop f4 is one that obviously could transpose back into what we were looking at before if white just plays knight f3 and into this sort of thing that we talked about. But there is the move order of e3, which is a move order that I like to play when playing these systems, and it's what you're usually going to face by this move order against strong players. And it sort of makes sense that, if we're playing bishop f5 before, it sort of makes sense to do it again, right? Because then if I play knight f3, you're just transposing back in these symmetrical positions that we saw previously. I will mention you can also play bishop g4, like that's also an interesting move order that actually can transpose into the main line that I'll be showing after bishop f5. However, it does also mean you have to be ready for f3, so it's something I'll probably leave more for a different video, like for a paid course if I do end up going that path. But bishop f5 is the most common move, and you're obviously going to be totally fine. After queen to b3, this is the way that I like to play it in the mid 2000s. Like I had a few nice wins with this as white. The idea is that after knight to a5, queen to a4, you're basically trying to get their bishop to a bit of an awkward position, where when they play e6, the bishop will be stuck inside the pawn chain. And that's sort of the reason why retreating the queen with queen e2 is considered a little bit more critical than a move like bishop to b5, which is kind of the old way of playing it. Like after e6, knight f3, there's going to be a lot of moves that are fine for black. Like knight c4 is the spicier option, but you can also just play very solidly with a6. Takes, and you're just going to develop normally and be totally fine. There's just not much I can really do to cause considerable problems. So with that, the move queen c2 is a little bit more ambitious to sort of make the point that, okay, our bishop is a little bit stuck, and yeah, our knight is on a5, which, on the one hand can give us some active counterplay of knight c4, but it also allows white to bring knight to e5 without as much opposition. So that's kind of an interesting trade-off, like what's going to kind of matter more in terms of the piece placement. The fact that white lost a tempo, in a sense, or the fact that some black's pieces may not necessarily be ideally placed. It's also worth pointing out this position can also arise from a move order of knight f3 and then bishop d3. It's just going to transpose there. But this one really is going to be the key position, and here I had a little bit of a tricky choice because I could just show the engine line that, if you know your theory, you just equalize. But something else I like to do is I like to show approaches that maybe your opponents are not going to be as ready for and that can maybe give you some better practical results according to statistics. And unlike in the past when I would sort of try to use the opening as kind of like let's say like a safety net of, okay, I'm going to use the opening to, avoid any risk of making any mistake early on. Now for me, it's more like, okay, I don't really care if my position is a little bit worse going to the computer, as long as I can sort of make it work practically. And that's sort of how I feel about the move of b5. That, yeah, white probably is a tiny bit better in this position, but I think black's plans are a lot clearer in that sort of structure compared to the bishop b4 moves. So yeah, if you are a more advanced player, like yeah, you can definitely look into these positions and not give white any way to get even a hint of an edge really against you. But b5 I think is just the more natural one. Like you're going to go for e4 and just have this queenside counterplay. And the move of a6 is just a nice way to kind of overprotect the pawn in advance of queen e2. And after castle's bishop e7, like yeah, this position is a tiny bit better for white if they play it correctly. But we also have a few interesting ideas we can kind of use just based on having accelerated our queenside play. Like, for example, let's say if they go knight to e5, which is the most common move by far. I actually found a very interesting trap here that, and it's also like the best move for black. Like, if they don't fall into a trap, you're still fine here. But it's also one I think really will catch out a lot of your opponents, because again, if it's not one of the top lines of engine, it's very unlikely that even a very well prepared opponent will have really studied it. Especially if they're not using some of the methods that I used in this video and in preparing this like this course style content of looking at the most common moves in the online database, not just the master database. But the move of knight h5 is a really nice one, and well done if you saw this from afar. Because at first glance it might look like you're just blundering a pawn with bishop h7, but it really is not quite that simple. If they played bishop g3, I kind of like the move of knight c4, just a way to kind of get that imbalance in the structure that gives you some good winning chances. You can also play g6, it's also fine, of course, but which kind of keeps your options a bit open. But as it happens, yeah, if they do take the pawn, which really I think is the big question to answer here. It's also the most common move by white in the database, just so you know. But then we're going to play knight takes f4 and not the move of g6, because then you are going to get mated. That's obviously not what you really want here. But we're going to play the move of bishop d6, and suddenly we're uncovering this attack of h4, of queen h4, that if the bishop moves, they get mated on h2. So g3, they cover it, but then we go bishop takes e5. Definitely not an easy move to consider. Like, it feels weird, to give up our bishop pair, but yeah, there is first the point that d5, d4 does win a piece with the pin on the knight to the queen. And after fe5, we actually have this really cool move of queen b6. And if white tries to defend that pawn to not just be a pawn down, like something like this is obviously going to be very nice for black, but if they do try to defend it, they actually end up getting into a worse and worse position. After knight c6, if they defend the pawn with queen d3, and there isn't really another move that defends both the pawn and the bishop, because obviously knight e2 is just opening up opening this up, right? But after queen d3, we now can snap the trap shut on white with the move of knight to e7. Where next move we're going to play g6, we're going to trap their bishop. I can see they're not really in time to get the bishop back as such. And we're just going to be up a piece and we're going to win. So and that's a nice little trick yeah, I've just been really excited to share for a while. And if they do play a move such as h3 to try to avoid knight h5, which is the advice of the computer, I mean, this is sort of the worst case scenario for black, but I still think that black is more or less doing fine here. Like you can play either bishop c6 or knight c4, like both moves are going to be alright here. With bishop c6, it does give them the option to play b3 and try and play against our knights. But I still think this position with moves like h6, rook fd8, knight h4, it's still going to fundamentally be okay for black. Like white's got a tiny edge, but it's nothing too major in my opinion. So yeah, that kind of shows the picture with bishop f4, like this queen b3 is the main way they can try to annoy us, and it is probably one of the better options for white in the exchange Slav, to be fair. But it's one of these cases where, yeah, it's like easier to play for white, but still very solid and fine for black's point of view. Now, what if they play bishop g5? What would be your move for black in this instance, just out of interest? So at this point, the move of knight e4 is actually really good here as well, even when you don't have the attack on the knight. Because here you also have a little bit of a trick, and I mean, black's position is pretty good even without it, but you might recall this loose pieces drop off theme that after e3, which has been played in nearly half the games online, but the problem is that queen a5 does just fork the king and bishop. Yeah, we win the bishop and we win the game essentially. So that's kind of the reason again why I don't really see bishop g5 all that much. I will also give an honourable mention to the move of f3, which you're very unlikely to see, but it is a little bit of a tricky move. But if you know the move of queen b6 and this kind of idea, you do just get a very good position as black. So if you're a more advanced player, you might like to explore that in your own time and see why this black is just doing very, very well in a position like this one. So just mentioning that, yeah, before we move on. And with that, yeah, the only other move that really I think makes sense for white, well, it doesn't really make sense, but like at least a move that white might sort of play is bishop f4. We've already kind of again seen how this is just very pleasant for black. Like I'm gonna go through it a little bit more quickly, just because we've kind of seen a lot of these ideas before with the bishop on g5, and the difference is just not that great, really, except that black just kind of has a better version of what we're looking at. The one move that's a little bit tricky is the move of b3, where, okay, there's a lot of good replies for black, to be fair, but just this move at e5 is a really cool motif where you can give back the pawn, but just have this incredibly annoying pin on the knight, which you're not really in a position to cover. And yeah, I mean, you even have tricks like this, like they can't take the bishop without, running into the fork like so. And, if they do move the queen away, then, you can even just really just go for the throat and just have a completely crushing attack due to the pin down the c file that they just can't really get out of in a good way. If they do play another move like bishop e2, again, it's kind of just like what we've seen before, just played in a Moran style. You're going to prepare to e5, c5 push, and black is just going to be much better. So bishop f4, yeah, not really a move to worry about too much, like as long as you don't let them get into e3 and kind of get a good London, and you take the pawn first, then you're just going to be better. And that does cover the picture with knight to c3, which is the move that you will face most often by quite a bit. That is true at master level. You will face the move knight f3 more often than knight c3. So I do want to make sure I do also really cover the other options like knight f3 and cd5 just to, yeah, really round off this video and make it quite a complete sort of repertoire in that sense. Just because of the length of the video, one thing I will do is I will kind of save the sort of deeper coverage of knight f3 and some of these d4 sidelines for a part 2 video because, yeah, it's obviously it would be a lot, yeah, to record like a whole 6-hour video in one sitting without editing. So it's just going to make it easier for me and easier for you in that way. Um, so with that, if we do go back to the move of c4 and all of this, so after knight f3, we're going to play knight f6 once again. And obviously, if they do play knight c3, like it just transposes back into the mainline Slav, classical Slav, whatever you want to call it, that we looked at in a lot of detail earlier in the video. I will say the Catalan with g3 is a little bit of an annoying kind of system potentially if you're not ready for it. But first I'll mention if they do play the slow Slav with e3. This actually is one of the reasons why I kind of suggested the Schlecter against knight c3 and e3. Because it kind of gives us a 2-in-1 system against the anti-Slav with knight c3, e3, and also with knight f3, e3. Because if you're just playing g6 whenever they play e3, it just makes your life so much easier in terms of move orders later when you get a bit more advanced. And the one way they could really try to play that doesn't involve just transposing to those knight c3, e3 lines of knight c3 would be to put the knight on d2. But first, you're not really going to see this very much anyway. You don't really need to prepare too deeply for it. And also black's play is just very, very natural. Like you can place the pieces like this. There's various moves like knight e4 is always going to be very thematic, and a5, a4 is kind of your way to get counterplay then on the queen side. But you really are kind of like playing a Schlecter Slav where they just have the knight on a worse square. You can also flick in h5 first and just kind of secure your bishop's placement, and then play knight e4 later. But it's kind of the same sort of thing. So really the move that I think is going to be the most common alternative you can probably expect is, other than like knight c3 and e3, is going to be the move of g3. And I did debate for a little bit of time like what system I want to recommend here. Because also like if they play kings in the attack move order, which I will cover like in a separate sort of part two or even part three video, then what sort of you play here may also affect that system too, in a sense, if you want to try to play the same way against everything. And that's kind of the reason why I've sort of gone with the move bishop g4, because here's the thing, if you play a move like g6, which is the engine's top line, the thing is now you've transposed into a Fianchetto Grunfeld, not a Schlecter. And so that's something that might be a little bit jarring for some people. And so I think playing more in a classical Slav spread is just going to make more sense. The move 95 is also a move for white. It's kind of a more advanced one, but I'm going to start with the one that you're going to see the vast majority of time first before getting into the master level stuff. But you can sort of see here we build our solid Slav pawn triangle, but where we're able to get our bishop outside the pawn chain compared to the semi-Slav. If they play queen b3, just queen b6 is just going to be a good reply. Like some people will take on b6, but that just helps you to improve your structure by activating the file for the rook. Kind of like in the London system, if you know that opening for white. But after castles, we can just play knight bd7, and you can see we just have a very flexible setup where I find that usually I prefer to put the bishop on e7 rather than d6, but it doesn't make the world's biggest difference, to be fair. Like if they go h3, I would probably just put the bishop on h5 would be the most natural. The computer does point out bishop f5 is quite interesting, but that's going to be a different London rather than Torre-based kind of setup. And if they play cd5, you're going to want to take back with the e pawn in this case. Because if you take with a c pawn, then the knight kind of wishes it on c6 rather than d7. Whereas this sort of Catalan doesn't really mesh that well with the exchange, because our pawn chain does kind of mean the Catalan bishop is biting a bit on granite. So the move you'll see the most common by far is actually the move of knight c3, according to the Lichess online database. And yeah, just a quick question. What would be your move as black from this point? So again, if you do decide just to develop quietly with a move like bishop e7, if you're playing against like a Grandmaster, you might suffer a little playing just automatic moves, but against everyone else, you can, yeah, definitely develop quietly and still be fine. But I want to show you how you can actually punish White's move order, because you might have heard a saying of like, don't play knight c3 in the Catalan without a good reason. And a reason for that is that after d takes c4, actually the knight on c3 makes it very hard to get the pawn back, because White kind of loses some of their options to try and regain the pawn later, and obviously queen a4, b5 isn't really what White wants. So the move a4 is a move that you're usually going to see, because like e4, bishop b4 just gives you some decent pressure against the center to kind of go with your extra pawn. And and after a4, there's actually a really cool move we can play that it's a little bit advanced, but if you think of it in terms of prophylaxis, it'll make a lot more sense. So at some point, we're probably going to want to play knight b6 to defend the pawn, but then a5 is going to be annoying, right? And so by playing this prophylactic a5, we don't just secure that square of b4 as an outpost like in some of the mainline Slav lines, but we also are able to meet knight e2 and knight b6 and keep our extra pawn without this problematic a5 move being on the cards as such. And if they do play e4, which is the most common move here, well, then a really instructive idea to remember. There's actually a few different moves black can play, like queen b6 is also quite good. But a really instructive idea is to use that pin with e5, so that if they do take, you can take with the bishop and then have the extra pawn and have that really beautiful outpost on d3 for the knights. And if they go d5, like the move that scores the best in Lichess is knight c5. That this idea of bringing the knight here is just very, very practically annoying. There are other moves too, like the engine kind of like cd5, and that's also just going to give black an extra pawn with a really good position. But yeah, the choice is yours too. Whether you want to play like a computer or just play based on the statistics, either way, it works pretty well for black. And with that, just to kind of quickly cover a few alternatives that you're not really going to face much except at a kind of 2000 or 2200 plus level. But if they do play queen c2, I think it is good to know that the Schlecter approach is more effective than usual because there will be some positions where you can try to gain a tempo on the queen. Actually, I remember there was a very recent game between, I think it was Carlsen against Abdusattorov, where Abdusattorov just played g6 and equalized very, very cleanly out of the opening in Siegmund Chess 2026. Bishop f4 in this London style approach is the one you'll face most often by far. If you want a creative alternative, you can also explore dc4. There are some interesting ideas for black in this case where you just don't let him take back with the bishop and, yeah, play for a bit more active piece play. But bishop g7 obviously is the one kind of keeping in with our system. And if they play knight c3, which is kind of the normal move here, to try to meet bishop f5 with queen b3 and make the point that this pressure is again a little bit annoying. A much better option for black is going to be to play in a Grunfeld style. Now, to be fair, there are other playable moves, but c5 is really the one that kind of exploits white's move order. That if they do take our pawn, we go queen a5. And we just get this very nice Grunfeld style play where they don't really want to take because then knight d5 is just putting more pressure on the knight, hitting the bishop. It's just not going to be any good for white, essentially. There are a lot of other moves they can play, but rook d1 is the one I've kind of made my main line, and I'm going to go a little bit deeper because one is aimed more at the masters, but basically you're going to get back the pawn and just have a very nice position where this knight a5 fork is going to be a little bit annoying for white. In fact, they should probably play the move of knight g5 already if they don't just want to be worse here. Just using the pressure on f7 and prompt e6. And after, if they go knight g4, you're just going to like take and queen a5 and use the tempo gain on the king just to be to be totally fine with normal moves. And if they play like queen b5 and go into an endgame, this endgame I think is very healthy for black. Like you'll sort of see that the bishop just has a really nice long diagonal, and you can play rook c8, get the bishop to the Hungarian square, bishop e8, as I talked about in my video quite recently on the classical Queen's Gambit decline for black. And there's different moves like bring the knight out or trading off the light squared bishops. Then you definitely can play for a win as black, and the engine even thinks it's a little bit easier to play for black at this stage. A couple of other honorable mentions of moves that are like probably not really that important to remember, but just to kind of cover our bases, I do think a5 is a really creative idea after queen b3, where you're sort of saying you have an exchange Slav where like these weird moves were both played by each side. But overall, there are some ideas we can go for like a4 in some positions, depending on what they do. Or you can also just play very solidly like e6. And yeah, I mean, white probably does have a better position here than they would in like the absolute main line of queen b3. But it's a way to just, avoid fury and just kind of get a healthy position to play. So a5, yeah, kind of a fun idea for the more advanced students. Also, actually looking here, I can see h3, h6 is another move that's also been played, but it kind of will transpose back to more familiar territory. Whereas a5, yeah, has a little bit more of that creative spin to it. Now, after c5, d5, yeah, we've already seen this is just a transposition to normal exchange lines. So that really does cover our base with knight f3, and it really leaves kind of the final system for this video being the lines with c takes d5. And then not playing a move like knight c3 or knight f3 to transpose back to the normal lines. But what if white plays bishop f4 and then, doesn't play a move like knight c3 but something a bit different? So there's kind of two options white can really go for other than knight c3. One of them is like a bit of a club player kind of move, and the other is a bit more of a high level move. So knight f3 is one that is actually a very interesting idea that I only found out about when I was preparing. Because I just thought, okay, black just goes bishop f5 and you just transpose back into the lines we saw before. But actually, bishop b5 is a very interesting extra option that I think actually gives white a very small advantage. So that's something you can even catch out opponents with as white potentially, if you play d4, c4 as white. The problem though is that queen b6 is a really nice way to punish the delayed knight c3. But if they do play something like queen b3 to defend it, well then you can just take and play e6. And I think the double pawns just give black a very comfortable game. For example, if bishop b5, like a way that you can play to just go knight h5 again as a way to trade off their bishop pair, get the bishop pair advantage yourself. and just to really kind of play for a win as black. Like even if they play it the best way, you still have a a very healthy position where you still get the bishops one way or the other. But if they do play bishop g3, which is the most common by far, again, like I've said, this video is all about setting it up that the most common reply style moves will be mistakes, and then we see how to punish them. And so after takes and f6, we see we're applying the distance 4 of dominating their knights, and then black is basically just going to be much better with some pretty familiar ideas like, just develop and expand on the king side. And it's very hard to really see what white is doing here. And that sort of explains a little bit why the move bishop d3 is a little bit more popular at a sort of higher level. I will say white can also play the move bishop b5, but that's something I'm going to leave more for the more advanced players to kind of explore in their own time if they want to. But if you're like a master player, you probably should have something against this. But after bishop to d3, I find that the move of bishop g4 kind of works well when you can't really go bishop f5. And if they play knight f3, you're just kind of getting an improved version of the lines of the Chebanenko with like a6, bishop g4, e6, because here you didn't have to play the move of a6. So instead you can just like play this a bit more directly. And if they do play in a London style with knight bd2, even moves like knight h5 give you some interesting ways to set some problems for white here. So it's definitely not a dry position after knight f3. There is that bit of asymmetry to work with. And the move f3 is one that's a bit less common at lower levels, but you will see it more at higher levels. And I kind of like the move of bishop h5, just again preparing to just get our bishop outside the pawn chain. And again, if you kind of compare it to something like this kind of a6 system, where you kind of go for a position like this sort of thing, again, you didn't have to lose a tempo on a6 to get the bishop to g4. You're able just to do it more directly, and you just kind of get a better version of those kinds of positions. If white does want to set some problems, they probably should play like queen to b3 and try to play it like this. But you just get very good play with just very natural moves here as black. Like white doesn't really have much of an edge at all. If they play knight g2, for example, you can just... I mean, the move order doesn't matter all that much, but like castling is pretty natural. Our plan will be to, like we've seen before, just trade off the light squared bishops and just play on the queen side with trying to get the knight to c4. So I explained a little bit why we're playing rook fc8 and not rook a to c8, because we want the rooks involved in the fight on the queen side, right? And if they do play knight a4, the move of knight a5 is just a really good counter to kind of beat them a little bit to the punch. And after queen b5, we have another cool move of bishop g6, again, just following strategic plans of trying to get that in that position where we have, the better bishop and the easier play on the queen side, since obviously knight c5 is not really on the cards here. And after rook c1, like the engine's going to say, that any move is going to be fine for black. But I think by keeping the rooks on the board, it does give you more chance to play for a win. And it might not seem like a whole lot here, but I do think that having those double pawns is kind of a way to grab that extra space. There are ways to improve the position, and I wouldn't say it's like just going to be a draw. There are ways to, try and grind white down from this position in sort of Capablanca or Carlsen kind of style. Now, let's say if they don't develop the king side, but do try to accelerate their queen side play instead, which is the way the engine wants to play it. This is kind of the worst case scenario theoretically, but I still think black is totally fine anyway. Just recycle the bishop for the knight, that gives you that imbalance to play for the win. And then we can just eliminate white's bishop pair advantage with bishop g6. And in a position like this, I think black is just doing totally fine. I'm not really too concerned at all about the second player's chances here. And I mean, yeah, that's really the worst case scenario, but not something that really will give white an objective advantage at the end of the day. And the one other move I will mention is if they do play e3 and they do play some weird thing like e3 combined with cd5. Because like obviously they go knight c3, it's just going to transpose back into the Schlecter like we just saw beforehand. But after cd5, knight c3, yeah, if they do play this, I've sort of come to the conclusion that even though e6 is the move that is kind of the way the engine wants to play it, it does lead to this very boring equality that I think it's not going to appeal to most players who want something a bit more unbalanced. And for that reason, I do think that the move bishop g4 is a gamble it's worth making. The reason it's a gamble is that if white finds this move of queen b3, they do get some interesting chances, but I still think the position is fundamentally fine for black even here. So I think it's something where we have a high payoff for not much risk. Because nearly everybody is going to play moves like bishop e2 or h3 here as white, and then bishop e2, just kind of breaking the pin. But then again, we kind of get what we want. We're sort of compared to some other positions we've seen, like the bishop is obviously kind of stuck, and you might remember that position where I showed like bishop g5 if black goes e6 that white's a bit better. We've basically got that same kind of position just with colors reversed, where in a position is quiet, the extra tempo just doesn't help white all that much. You could also put the bishop on f5, but keeping the pin is definitely the more natural of the moves. And the most common move for white in the database is just to go a3, but it just doesn't really have the desired effect. Where after rook c8, like there are already some tactics have to be a little bit mindful of potentially. And if they do play a more solid move like bishop d2, then a really interesting idea compared to just, developing quietly is to play bishop b8 and kind of set up a little bit of a battery where you go queen d6 and have some mate threats. You're not really playing it to checkmate, but just to create some little weaknesses in their position. And if they do expand on the queen side, I think knight e4 is again a really nice way to prepare queen d6. Sometimes you can also go f5 and kind of bring the pieces toward the attack on the king. But it's very clear though that black is just in a very, very comfortable position here. Like if white just plays a random move like queen to c2, for instance, you can kind of see here how like knight g3, these sort of tactics are just going to be very bad news for the white king if they do lose their sense of danger. So with that, that really completes the whole picture on the of the Slav defense and presenting with you this repertoire. And I'm really glad, I was able to kind of really go deep into it and show you the different ideas. Now, like I said, I'm going to focus more on the alternative c4 in the sort of second part, because otherwise the video is just going to be like 6 hours long, and that'd be a little bit too much even for me. But I do want to share like a couple of ideas just very, very briefly, just to like at least give you a starting point and fit the what I promised of at least giving something against the alternatives. So against knight to f3, if they go bishop f4, I would recommend the move of bishop to f5, and I think this is quite a nice solid approach for black, which I'll go into a lot more deeply in a later YouTube video. There is, if you want something very creative, I do think the move of a6 and bishop g4 can kind of be an interesting approach, but it does fall a little bit flat from a computer point of view. Like if white plays c4 and doesn't just let us play our bishop g4 setup, white can fight for an advantage. So that's why like I prefer bishop f5 on the more objective level, let's say. And if they do play something like the Colle, then I find g6 is a really nice move to basically make it if they play c4, just transpose back into the Schlecter. So you can kind of see how a lot of the systems I'm covering here do sort of fit with things I've covered within the Slav. Like also bishop g5, knight e4, we've seen that idea before. Or g3 and bishop g4, like we're making it so if they play c4, it transposes back into what we were looking at previously. And if they play bishop f4 directly, you can kind of see that there are some subtleties, like in the video, like in the second part, I will show what happens like if they do play moves like bishop d3 or c4 to try to benefit from the delayed knight to f3. So all that it will be addressed, and we're also going to touch on things like what to do against the Colle, what to do against the Jabava London. I'll be showing a really cool idea starting with the move bishop f5 that will sort of allow you to play in a similar spirit to Slav, which is also definitely going to be quite surprising for your opponents. I have some ideas that I'll be really excited to show you in the second part. And also, covering things like, how to deal with the Black Martima Gambit, why the Tromposky is kind of less effective when you haven't played the move of knight f6 already, like this, for instance. And also, I'm even going to include as a bonus in that second part also how to deal with the flank openings, like how to play, like if they go for c4 and like how to play these Slav type positions. I have actually covered a video quite recently on the channel of how to beat knight f3, where I did already cover this in some depth, but this is going to be a bit more of a personalized repertoire for Slav players in the second part, rather than a more generic coverage that I did in the how to beat knight f3 vid. But also showing how you can again kind of adapt the setup, like with for example, it's king's in attack, how you can still play bishop g4, so that you're kind of playing a similar kind of setup depending on where they place their pieces, like g3, bishop g4, this kind of Pavlovian reaction from us. Then we really start salivating like Pavlov's dogs when the when the bishop goes to g2. And also, covering things like also what to do if they play like b3, like how you can again put the bishop on g4 and just again play very systematically, like kind of a reverse torre. And also, yeah, how to play like after c4, c6, and some of the move order points in the English there, because it is true that they do have the option of playing e4 and transposing into the pseudo Panov or Panov Botvinnik attack. So it's obviously something, yeah, you want to kind of make sure that you're ready for, but it is getting a little bit more advanced. So again, covering it more in the second part. But I do have a very creative idea in this position, like that's not one of these three main moves that I think you're going to like quite a lot as a creative shortcut in this position. But I'm going to leave that more for the part two video rather than like going too deep into it. But at least you kind of know what to expect. And, like I said, if you've tapped that notifications bell to all, then it's going to mean you're going to see that video right when it comes up, and you're not going to miss out on the explanation of these really cool ideas I just showed here. But with that, yeah, that completes the picture of the Slav defense for black. I wish you luck with playing it in your own games, and sort of, also as a little bit of a small reward for those of you who did, complete this, obviously, a very long training, that, really tried to make it better than most of the paid courses out there, and to, just give it away and really, offer something that really makes a massive impact rather than just trying to make a living selling a course. I'd rather than like just trying to survive, I'd much rather just make an impact. And that's really what inspires me to create this YouTube content, and is to go like so much deeper than virtually any other creator out there to really show, how to play much better openings. And, I just trust, that it's going to lead to kind of good sort of karma in a sense. But the sort of more personal thing I kind of want to share other than that, for those who, do watch these videos all the way to the end, I actually am going to be making a little bit of a shift in kind of how I do my coaching. Because in the past, I was just kind of offering like private one-on-one coaching just as a more, like with chess, as a kind of more safe thing, like kind of, stay in your lane, like give back to the chess community sort of thing. But I've sort of realized that, that I have a lot of things to offer that really go even just beyond chess skills as such. One of the other topics I'm really passionate about is just how to live a better life in general, how to feel, a lot happier, to be a lot more engaged in what you're doing, and also a lot more confident when when you put yourself out there. And if those are things that you want to have, if you want to not just have improvements in your life, but have like real breakthroughs and real transformations, which just allow you to really kind of live from your best self. And I do want to let you know that I am currently offering high performance coaching to a very limited number of clients. This is like very high end. So like if you're not, let's say, like in a quite decent financial position, then it's probably not going to be the thing for you. But if you are someone who is kind of like already like, let's say you've got a family, or you've got like a pretty decent paying job, but you're looking for like that kind of next level of impact and just making your life a lot better, not just for yourself but for the others also in your life, then do make sure to send me an email. I just put a link in the description of illingworthchess@gmail.com if you're interested in that kind of high performance coaching. Because if you are, like, I do have an application process to just make sure that it's going to be like the right fit of people, that it's working with people who like I know I can like really help. They're going to get the most out of it, and just, yeah, make sure it's just the right fit in that sort of way. But if that is something that does interest you, yeah, just let me know. Send an email, and I'll kind of send you like the details, like how to apply for it, and we'll take it from there. And also, I will add, like, if your application is successful, then you're going to get like a free like session with me. I'll actually like take you through the process, and you'll get to kind of experience it. It's like if it's basically something where you like have nothing to lose. Like if your application isn't successful, it is what it is. But if it is, you are going to get like a lot of really great value whether you do end up signing up for me as a a high performance student or not. So, and I kind of mentioned it at the end because it's something I don't really want to just offer for like anyone, but something for the more kind of really serious students. So, by watching to the very end of this video, you kind of you passed the first test. So congratulations. But yeah, that's all from me, and I will see you in the next training. Take care.